You're on it, Marion. All right. Good morning, everyone. Today is the November 5th, 2021 meeting of the Vermont Climate Council Agriculture and Ecosystem Subcommittee. Let's see. For our agenda today, we're going to do some administrative actions right off, then really focus primarily today on our matrix of pathways, strategies, and actions that were provided to the Climate Council earlier in this week to just kind of refine and go over some outstanding issues. Jane's going to give us a little introduction to kind of where we are in the process and what we need to do this month to help the council get to their December 1st deadline. So with that, can we approve that draft agenda and the minutes from October 29th? Everyone go with that? Okay, looking good. And then on the agenda formally, we do want to really thank everyone for their hard work over these many months, but especially over the last couple of weeks where there was a really heavy lift to pull together, our real ranging suite of actions into a really kind of cohesive and I think well articulated narrative around climate action for resilience, adaptation, sequestration, storage in the agriculture and ecosystem space. So thanks to members who spent a ton of time drafting, staff who are really integral and critical to pulling everything together, for individual members who spent a lot of time having sometimes difficult conversations about how to move certain issues forward. So great deal of thanks and appreciation to everyone for that work. We're almost there. We can give ourselves a round of applause in 3 weeks. Yeah, now.
Yeah,
and then
I'll jump in for that. You guys rock. This was real hard. I think it was real hard. Maybe you don't. Maybe this was a walk in the park for all of you, but not for me. So just so much gratitude. And I do, when I was reading through the documents and kind of seeing it all come together, I think Billy's really correct that at the end of this, it's we have really done a fair amount of justice to what is 90%, 94% of our land base and how we might hope to steward it moving forward. And just immense gratitude to all of you for stepping up in the way. Really appreciate it. Okay, now I'm going to finish my oatmeal.
You got to eat, Abby. All right. So more celebration to come, but for right now, I think we're going to hand it over to Jane to kind of walk us through where we stand in the overall process and what we need to get done the rest of this month.
Morning, everybody. So thank you for that, and I appreciate Abby and Billy taking the time to thank you all, and really want to echo the same sentiment. It feels like a monumental hurdle that we're still running right now for me till the end. I already have told many of you this, but I've started to equate December 1st to Y2K. It feels like this date that we have to get to and get past and realize that the world is not going to end and that there's still going to be progress on these issues. So thank you for putting up with the unbearable timeline and all the missteps along the way. Along that line, I'm going to do my best to provide clarity around the timeline and what's to be expected over the next few weeks. I do know that there is a lot of interest and intent amongst counselors, amongst others, to have a more robust, different kind of conversation over the next weeks. And at that direction, we're meeting this afternoon at 4 o'clock, sort of as an emergency special meeting of the steering committee to just consider the timeline and consider an appropriate meeting schedule in order to meet the goals of a process. So we've had clear direction around decision making up until this point, but there are certain counselors who want to revisit that as a group and think about how it's going to really work and what we're going to be able to achieve for December 1st. recognizing how hard the timeline is. So bearing any like major change this afternoon coming out of that meeting, the understanding and expectation put forward in the CAP drafting guidance, as well as the timeline adopted by the council for the meetings that we have on the schedule, you're sort of up on Tuesday. Abby had a great suggestion at the end of the council meeting last week, recognizing and appreciating the hard work you all did to meet the timeline to get the draft up on Wednesday this week and to give the council 6 full days to review the content of the work. Abby suggested that perhaps the co-chairs of both Ag and Eco and Rural Resilience could yield their presentation time to allow for a more robust back and forth conversation that was only able to happen really at the last hour and a half of the meeting on Tuesday because of presentations. And I think those presentations for cross-sector were necessary because we didn't meet the timeline of giving the council enough time to review the materials, as well as all of you were also working to get your drafts up and people didn't have time to be drafting and reviewing materials. We were only able to really scratch the surface with cross-sector. We used a survey similar to the survey that is now posted with all of your materials for counselors to elevate issues and gaps and opportunities for council members to direct the conversation. And we really were able to get to like a quarter of the issues that were raised. And it was a really great back and forth that moves the needle on those issues. And so hopefully understanding the breadth and depth of all of your work and rural resilience is a lot also. Hopefully we'll be able to get to more of it on Tuesday. But the goal and expectation at this point is that we won't hit everything on Tuesday and that there'll need to be more conversation with the council to get us to a comfort level to adopt the plan for December 1st. Currently, the way the schedule reads is that based on Tuesday's conversation and the survey, which you'll all have a summary of on Monday to inform what counselors are going to want to talk about, so you can be prepared for that. The expectation is that drafts would be revised based on the feedback, based on consensus consideration by the subcommittee by the following Tuesday, the 16th. But I recognize and appreciate that for cross-sector, that felt kind of weird to be working on final drafts for next week, knowing that the council only got to a very small portion of their considerations. So I expect that will be the same for all of you. That said, we'll just continue to make progress. And so Marion and I can drop in the chat, one of us, the CAP drafting process, and remind you all that in that CAP drafting process at the end, there is a table that is expected to be a guide for how you can respond to comments that you'll hear from the council. Cross-sector is using staff capacity to fill in all of the comments and issues that are elevated in that table. We can do the same for all of you. And then task leads, pathway leads, however you'd like to organize, can work with staff capacity to fill in a response. It's like a responsiveness survey to the comments and work to update your draft to the best of your ability for the 16th. But I also appreciate that it's going to be a fluid process with drafts, and the goal really is that the end game at this point is November 23rd is the final comprehensive draft. And so whatever we have sort of between now and then around conversation and reflection will just require us to be in flux, making updates and changes to the drafts based on your comfort level as a subcommittee. So where you need to get to today, I think, is there's been some changes already and considerations amongst your subcommittee on some of the pathways. There'll be some great discussion. And then hopefully you can organize yourselves around any updates or revisions that you want to do proactively on your draft, and otherwise really be in a holding pattern to the council discuss them on Tuesday, and we'll be able to consider how far they got next week and figure out how to take it from there, and any guidance from the steering committee this afternoon. So my apologies for sort of like flux, but I think that it's going to be a heavy lift between now and the Monday before Thanksgiving, but I'm hopeful for all of you that the Monday before Thanksgiving is sort of the end for you, and then the fun starts for Mary and I for the week leading up to when the sort of more final draft will be adopted on December 1st. And so hopefully it's really 2 more weeks of really intense work for the subcommittee in getting to a place that's good for December 1st and understanding what the next steps will be beyond December 1st.
Thanks,
So
Jane.
that's really all I, go ahead. Bill.
Great. Well, just to kind of summarize that, and please correct me if I'm wrong, it sounds like we're presenting on next Tuesday, which is the 9th. We'll get comments in advance of that, some additional comments and discussion at that meeting. This group will meet on the 12th to continue to refine our work. We'll go back to the council on the 16th and potentially get more comments from them. We'll have an opportunity at our meeting on the 19th to kind of finalize our work that will go to the council on the 23rd, and they'll basically be done at that point. So we've got a couple weeks where it's going to be this iterative process going back and forth between our own internal comments and conversations and feedback from the council, and we're going to kind of be working however we decide to kind of move that stuff forward. Great, thank you.
I'm going to put that in chat, and if I have anything wrong, Jane, let me know.
Abby.
I just have a logistical question. In terms of the drafts, I'm still I'm so sorry. Is there a SharePoint site where we can all, what I found when we were going through trying to review the drafts was that like Marley and I spent a lot of time at one point trying to figure out which draft I had put which comments into and then trying to figure that out. And I just wondered if there is like a place where each draft lives from this point on, where comments can be added as a consistent, you know, so that there's a consistency around it, or does that violate open meeting law and that's why that doesn't happen? I just wanted a little clarity around that. And if possible, I did have the thought that logistically it might make it a lot easier if there was just, you know, this is where you go to access the working drafts at this point, and anything you want to add into that, track changes and work from that.
Can Jane and Marion speak to that? Yeah.
We have, Marion and I manage a couple SharePoint sites. One where all of the minutes and agendas and the drafts go before they then go to a public SharePoint site that is the sort of the backside of the website. And that public site, anybody can go to and view. And Marion worked to get some of you all, the folks who are in charge of drafting, access to that. We've been really hesitant. We don't want to use that SharePoint site with the council because it's just too much to manage, but there is the capacity, and Marion, being way better at this than me and technically savvy, could probably explain how to consider using the SharePoint with drafters. I will admit it was crazy time, like over the weekend with Marley and I. Marley deserves like the most amazing round of applause for managing a million drafts and keeping us all straight. So yeah, it was a lot of drafts coming in and trying to manage. And I do think that there's probably a better way to do it if we want to work off. And we can have that as long as it's task leads or under quorum working on a certain document on SharePoint. We can do that as long as it's not a subcommittee process on that document. So we can do that.
Yeah, just following up. That's what we've done with rural resilience, and they just have one draft. You all have the ag mitigation piece, the sequestration, and the resilience and adaptation pieces. So I actually think that would make it easier because it would be much less than a quorum working on those specific documents. I think what we could do is grant editing access to the task leads that wrote those documents, and then view only access to the rest of the subcommittee, so that you could see changes that are being made, but then it's task leads that can put comments in and make changes. So I think we could work on that. I think that's doable, if that's what you all want to use moving forward.
And I just want to check if there's any member who can't access or has not been able to access SharePoint. We just need to take that into account for access reasons. So is there any member who has not been able to access SharePoint in the past? And definitely speak up, so I wanted to accommodate for that.
Yeah, and a note for everyone, you have to use your partner email to access SharePoint. It won't work with your business or personal email.
John, have you been able to?
To be honest, I haven't tried in a long time. I used to be able to, so we'll give it a whirl at some point.
Okay. Judy, have you been able to access SharePoint? Judy, you're on mute.
I haven't accessed it. I don't know if I can. I haven't accessed it. I don't even know what it is.
It can be a little finicky, so that's the one thing my only concern about that, but maybe we can find a way to work with people who sometimes challenge to get in there. We will circle back to this at the end, but I think, Baron, your suggestion is task leads would have kind of control of the document, and people could send them comments or ideas or suggestions, and they would do the edits, but it would be transparent. People could see that and could see what changes were being made. Abby, how does that sound, Abby?
Yeah, that sounds great. I don't want to make it less accessible. I was headed towards a hopefully more accessible path. So whatever falls out in that regard is fine. Just wanting, I was just thinking it might be helpful to have a, one access point or something, but.
Yeah, let's loop back to this and figure out how we want to kind of manage versions. But glad you raised the question, Abby.
Great.
Marion and I can work closely, especially with Marley and Billy and Abby and folks who have been really closely involved in the review to come up with a plan.
My hope is that barring a few little changes, everything is great and we won't need to do much. So maybe we won't need much of a system at all.
Love your optimism.
Ever the optimist.
Okay, any other kind of questions for Jane around process, our role going forward, timeline? As clear as it can be. Good. Okay. So let's see. I think at this point we're moving into the kind of substantive part of our meeting where we're going to have some conversation. I failed to mention that we will have at least one opportunity for public comment at 11:10 or focused around 11:10. We hope to adjourn a little early today, but we've got till noon if we need it, I think is the understanding. So, all right, Pat, I guess I'll hand it over to you. And, I would benefit from kind of an overview of what we're going to do today from you, because I know in the agenda there's references to certain pathways and sections, and that may not resonate for everybody. So, I know I have some kind of just high level questions about what should be in the resilience section versus the sequestration section. So it'd be good to have an opportunity to kind of understand from you how we're going to approach the conversation today.
Right. So here was our thought. People work so hard and people are tired. So we didn't expect everybody to go back through the final documents and be ready to dive into detailed comments today. We'll talk at the end about how to move from here to that for next week, along with whatever council comments. And just to note that this, the draft, I hope Billy's optimism is right. We don't have a lot more to do from your perspective, but again, if you all have final thoughts or comments, because we had to rush this so quickly, we have some cleanup of our own to do just among our subcommittee, not to mention addressing the council's comments, which to come. So our thought was, Billy, maybe we start with the organization question. We had to kind of make some decisions about what went where. So if people have broad thoughts about that, maybe we start there. Then what we thought we would do is just each of the pathway leads who just did the writing, some of them actually came across things that either weren't addressed or they had to change or they had to think about. I just want to give a chance for each of the pathways for any of the kind of person who wrote and sort of managed the document, any kind of outstanding issues they want to raise today for discussion, because I know there's some folks have a few. And I want to kind of just, that'll be the primary work. If you feel like your pathway was in pretty good shape and there's not a lot to talk about, you can say that. If you came across stuff you want this group to wrestle with, then let's raise that today. And we thought we'd kind of go through that in that way. We also need to kind of talk about education got moved to cross-cutting, so we need to talk about that. I know there's one or two things in there we need to discuss. Lauren, when she comes on later, is going to talk a little bit about kind of the cross-cutting land use piece and how some of the stuff currently in our land use document probably gets over to that other part. So we'll cover those things too. but maybe we start with the overall organization and then we go back through the pathways. How does that sound?
Great. Sound good, everyone? Nods, stares, thumbs, good.
Okay, so organization overall, about what pathway went into what section, Billy? I mean, maybe do you want to start and any questions you have about that?
Yeah, so I just, for everyone's benefit, I think the CAP outline mirrors the structure of the Global Warming Solutions Act and really focuses on kind of mitigation, storage and sequestration, resilience and adaptation. So I think our charge was to kind of take our various pathways and nest them under those three larger buckets. And a lot of our work is kind of cross-cutting amongst them, or at least between resilience and storage and sequestration. So it wasn't there wasn't always natural breakpoints for those things. And I think Lauren kind of took the lead in suggesting how that split would happen. I think largely from my perspective, it's fine. My main question was whether, well, let me back up. At the council meeting last week, the consultants who did the carbon budget and some other of the modeling presented some really interesting data on the value of Vermont's landscape to store and sequester carbon, and basically made the finding that we need to largely maintain the kind of current levels of storage and sequestration from our landscape if we want to achieve our 2050 net zero target that's required in the act. So really kind of confirm the significance of our landscape as a climate solution, and one that we need to basically maintain, if not expand, if we want to hit those targets that are required now by law. So I would like to be sure we bring that kind of fact and that narrative into our sections, which is one comment. And then the second comment is whether some of the pieces that we currently have under resilience and adaptation, excuse me, related to land conservation and potentially some of the economic pieces that support our working lands owners and managers get pulled into the storage and sequestration section rather than the resilience and adaptation section. And I say that because storage and sequestration is going to be a required strategy to achieve our statutorily mandated goals. So I just wonder if nesting it under storage and sequestration gives it more oomph than having it in the resilience and adaptation section. And those could just be total semantics, but that was a question that came up in my head. So I'll just put that out there for folks to consider. And Jane and Marion may have thoughts, but I think, land conservation as a strategy is equally around maintaining our landscape's ability to kind of store and sequester carbon as it is maintaining resilience and adaptation.
Brian, you had a thought? Yeah, let's have a bit of discussion about this. So Billy, on the first point about including that nice chart about right now we're declining, we need to stay heavier, go up. I think that's easy to add in the front piece for sure. And Abby, I think you were the author of the sequestration piece, right? The overall viewpoint. Okay. Ryan, over to you.
I think absolutely agree, Billy, highlighting the importance of maintaining, protecting, and enhancing sequestration potential of national working lands is something to definitely call out in that section, and just calling to our attention that California does have a mitigation coefficient associated with agricultural land conservation in California for their purposes of accounting for climate change mitigation. So I know that's not directly related, but there are other states that have called it out explicitly as a pathway. And I think putting it in sequestration or calling it out in both sections, I think is definitely worth to consider. And I think that's one of the largest challenges when dealing with AFLLU is many of the practices or strategies can affect each one of those categories at the same time, whether it's mitigation, sequestration, or resilience and adaptation. Thanks.
Jane, then Judy.
I was just going to comment on, there's a lot of back and forth within our agency on that slide this week, and Ali, our kit head, is a nice email that I'll forward to all of you so you can read. Ali Kasiba, who I don't think is with us today, but she really spoke to the three compounding impacts on why sequestration is expected to go down so much, and it's really about forest loss, about forests getting older and not sequestering as much as a result, and then finally climate change impacts compounding all of that. And I just wanted to highlight that it really speaks to our interest in the work that we'd like to do with Harvard Forest around, or with Harvard, I should say, not Harvard Forest, with Jonathan Thompson, around really getting an understanding of what our future sequestration and storage capacity are based on current policies and decisions, as well as if we pull different policy levers. It's not dissimilar from the kind of work that we're doing in the emissions space right now, but could have a better understanding of what sequestration and storage looks like in the future in Vermont. But that graph is really compelling, because I think you've probably all heard me say that based on our current sequestration and storage, we would be net zero around 2030 if we were to hit our statutory emissions reductions requirement. But what this is showing is we should not expect that to be the case based on our current loss of sequestration and storage. So I think that's really interesting.
Judy, over to you.
I'm still in learning mode, and I just recently learned that when a forest is cut down in Vermont, it's still considered a forest unless houses are built on it. Could you please explain how any chart will work to express the correct amount of carbon storage if we're counting forests that have been cut down as forests?
Someone speak to that accounting.
Yeah, I can try, and Charlie may be able to better. And it's unfortunate that Allie's not here, because she's the one who is, has the kind of real background in this. But my understanding is that forests that are managed where there is some level of harvesting happening, where trees are cut down with the expectation and the goal that those trees are going to grow back, or that forest is going to regenerate at that harvest site. That's all considered forests in different stages of succession. So, natural conditions also have that dynamic where windstorms, fires, other dynamics knock trees down within a forest. Those trees grow back over time. That's all considered forest. When trees are cut down for a land conversion, to either clear for agriculture, to build homes or other kind of permanent structures, then it's no longer a forested use. The management, the harvesting of those trees is to kind of convert it to a different land use. So that's the construct that I think you're speaking to, Judy. And I know that the carbon budget that Allie worked on does factor in the emissions associated with timber management, I believe, the kind of ongoing forestry that occurs across the landscape here in Vermont, as well as that land conversion where forests are taken out of forest land use and put into some other use. And I believe it looks at those two activities separately and ascribes different carbon benefits and costs to it. That's my understanding. I certainly could be wrong, but I think that that is the approach of the carbon budget.
Thank you, Billy. But that doesn't answer my question. I believe and I think is not answering the question as to how it's accounted for. The lost carbon is accounted for.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm not the expert. Unfortunately, Allie's not here. She is. We can get her to provide it, unless others on the call on the meeting currently have that answer.
I wonder, Marion and Jane, if we could keep track of Judy's really good question and see if Allie maybe could respond and to the full group, just so we can kind of get an answer to the good question.
And please read, apparently there's a comment in the chat box as well.
Yep, but old versus new forest for sure. Abby.
I apologize. COVID quarantine's the worst. So I didn't really hear what Ryan said, but my suggestion would also be that I think that there's a pathway where, or I'm wondering if anything tied into agroforestry, sorry, or
No problem.
oh my God, agroforestry, land conservation, like Billy suggested, et cetera, should be put into that sequestration potential. Just thinking about how much forest land that farmers do manage, and sort of the current frameworks within the land trust based on when we've worked with them with easements, where if you're a farm easement, the conservation of forest is not prioritized, and there's a little bit of interesting stuff around that. And I've just wondered if, I think anything that we can do to provide clarity around the importance of a functional whole systems ecosystem easement is going to be really good in terms of our ability to further sequester. Does that make any sense?
No, that did. So Abby, I'm going to name, I just looked at it. So it looks to me, if we were to move pathway F is land use, which David knows. 1 is about kind of compact settlement, which might end up being in the cross sector section. 2 is really about biodiversity and resilience. This is strategies under pathway F. But strategies 3, 4, and 5, I think, could go into sequestration and storage. Billy, I want to check if this makes sense. And then we can also go back and look for agroforestry or other things potentially that maybe need to go there too. So that was, Billy, if I was trying to operationalize your suggestion, I think that's probably what we'd look at.
That sounds good. Yeah, and I don't want to overcomplicate this. It seemed like an opportunity. So if folks are open to us kind of looking at what Pat articulated, we can think about restructuring it the next draft that way. And maybe just bounce it off the council also on Tuesday.
Any other comments or questions on that, just organization? And we have an outstanding question to answer for Judy regarding the way the budget works. Judy.
I have another question, I guess. What you said earlier, Patrick, that we're going to send that, whatever you were talking about, to cross-cutting. What is cross-cutting?
Good question. Jane, can you explain those cross-cutting chapters? Judy, great question.
Yeah, I can drop in the chat too, but it's just a recognition and appreciation that some of the pathways that we've worked on within our respective subcommittees have broader impacts than the one specific focus maybe that they were written for. So compact settlement is one, right? You guys all have a number of strategies and actions that speak to the benefits of compact settlement, but compact settlement, it has beneficial values for emissions reduction, sequestration, land use, resilience, adaptation. And so we've organized the climate action plan, the center of the plan around the different buckets of climate action, resilience and adaptation, sequestration and storage, emissions reductions. And then at the end, there is an area on cross-cutting pathways that lift up and enhance all of that preceding work. So education pathway that you all have drafted, because it really is core to meeting all of our climate action goals, will be in that section. So it's just an organization of the climate action plan. And Lauren and Iris have been helping with that.
Okay, and I have one more question. One of my recommendations was that we put in a definition for the word sustainability, and that was excluded from the draft. And I still believe strongly we should have a definition of that in there. Because clearly there's
That's a great idea, and Marion is actually in charge of the glossary section of the climate action plan. And not everybody did this in your draft, but one draft in particular had definitions at the end of the section. I can't remember which one now for you all, but the intent was that you were supposed to highlight words in drafts that you would want to be carried into a glossary, and that was spelled out in the CAP drafting guidance. And so if we can certainly work with all of you on the appropriate definition for sustainability, and that should definitely be in the glossary.
So is there a question on that? Is someone drafting that definition so each of the subcommittees can look at it and give input? I assume ultimately the council will decide, but is there anybody drafting that that we could look at now, or what's the status of that?
I already gave it to you, Patrick. You cut it out.
Which is the, I'm not, Judy, this one I might have missed. So you're not referring to the language section in education. You're referring to something else, right?
Yeah, I'm referring to a definition for sustainability as it refers to biomass.
Okay. One, because that's probably something I apologize. That's something I missed or didn't figure out what the broader intent you were doing. So one, let me pull that out and send that around to everybody after today. And then that's at least a starting point for further conversation. Okay. All right, I'll look back in, Judy, I'll look back in your emails.
Thank you.
All right, Bill, anything else on that? And then I think we'll start going through pathways.
Thank you.
Okay, pathway A, I think was primarily Ryan and Charlie. So I don't know, Ryan, if or Charlie, there's specific things in pathway A that as you were pulling this together, you wanted to highlight for this group right now that you had trouble writing, or you realized, geez, I'm not sure we have agreement, or whatever it might be.
I don't have anything specific for this morning, no.
Okay. And if you don't, that's totally fine. And Ryan, did you have anything on the ag parts of pathway A you wanted to raise?
I have, after the deadline, I've received some comments from folks, which after we received comments from the Climate Council on Tuesday, definitely we'll look to integrate and provide feedback and make sure those comments are embedded in the next draft. Did our best to be responsive of comments that we've received for publication on Tuesday. I think we've discussed many of these strategies at length, both within 5C and high level in Ag and Ecosystem Subcommittee. And so hopefully directionally they're in the right space, and specific language or details that folks would like to see highlighted. We can definitely work to embed that over the next week. But I don't think there was anything particularly challenging in the Pathway A document that was kind of the high level ag mitigation, and then embed some of the other PES principles, and then of course Charlie's sections. So sorry, that's my rambling summary.
Well, that's fine. And any other kind of, again, if we go through these quickly, that's good. Again, we're going to do more thorough review next meeting. But any other kind of questions about Pathway A right now? Anything that caught people's eye in particular? Okay, Pathway B, Alyssa, that's you worked on, and I know you, as you were writing, you found a few things you wanted to raise. So Alyssa, I turn that over to you.
Great. Yeah. So thanks everybody who inputted. I only got comment input from a couple people. One subcommittee member in particular was very concerned about even minor changes in wording to the language that was in the matrix, which we have subcommittee consensus on. So I have a draft of this chapter that has kind of all of those, even like the changes in hyphenation or specific, arrangements of words modified, and wondered if folks feel like we should consistently across all of the chapters make sure that everyone has seen any even like minor modifications in language, because that was very important to one person. And then so that's something I'd love just folks to weigh in on like whether or not you'd all be happy to just check off on a draft written version, or if we should go over those minor changes in a meeting together. And then the other pieces to highlight, I think, are this is the chapter that had the recommendations around creating an interagency office of climate change and reviving the state central planning office. And at our last meeting, we had agreed that we would include those, but they would have kind of some notes about the disagreement in there, noting one, that there was disagreement, and also trying to represent like the two sides of the debate. And one of the people who reviewed the draft really didn't felt very strongly that it was confusing to have a recommendation that also recommends against itself in the same paragraph, which was great advice. So we, the co-chairs, Abby and Billy and Pat and a couple of us decided to take out all of the rest of the language. And it now just reads as like the very simple version of that recommendation with an asterisk that says it's an important topic that has outstanding disagreements that we will work through to continue discussions in November about within our group. So that
I don't know if now is the moment to have that conversation, but we need to decide how to include those things in the document. In what capacity, you know, are they full recommendations? Do we include disagreement? Can we work through that in advance? If we can't, what do we do? So I'm just going to go through my list of things I want to bring attention to, and then maybe co-chairs, you can decide when and where we have those conversations. So one is like small changes to language around the specific recommendations. Two is this kind of the Central Planning Office and Interagency Office of Climate Change debate. And then the third piece that I think I just want to elevate to the group is that there were a couple strategies at the latter half of this document that really only had a couple or no actions that were elevated and prioritized. And we had a nice suggestion, actually, I'm going to just say it was Allie made a really great suggestion that we combine them into one strategy with multiple actions. Then they're all around kind of promoting vegetative growth in riparian areas and healthy connected river corridors and really waterway and water body health and wetland restoration and protection. And so that's a change that we just love everybody to be okay with, kind of reshaping the way that that's organized with very minimal changes to language. So those are the three things that I just want to bring attention to the group and make sure that whatever direction we go, everyone feels good about.
So let me just go through those each one. So one is like, you did keep a red line strikeout, is that right, of the version, right?
Yeah, I do. I can share that right now, but I don't know if that's what you want to do at this moment, but yeah.
And I wonder if, I know there was a particular member who had some concerns about that. I don't know whether it's worth just involving that person in that conversation, whether it's better for the whole group to look at it. I get a little worried about trying to edit that detail as a bigger group, but how do people want to handle, you know, where I think one member did raise some concerns about just editorial, what appear to be editorial changes, but, you know, language matters. Is that something that Alyssa can just engage with that member, or is it something we need to do as a full group? Thoughts?
I'm fine for there to be a one-on-one conversation, and if anything needs to come back to the larger group, we can deal with it.
Okay with everybody? Okay. All right. Then why don't we, maybe Alyssa, let's pull up, maybe we should pull up the Central Planning Office and the Climate Office piece.
Can I just give some context here? And I don't think this member will mind that we're using names here. So, you know, Lauren wasn't at the meeting where, and nor was I, where you all kind of decided on this approach for these two topics. When Lauren reviewed Alyssa's draft, she raised some concerns and questions. I made it clear that this was what the group had decided. So I think, you know, if you all still want to stick with the way that you managed this at the last meeting, I think that's fine, and we can just engage with Lauren around that. And if she still has real concerns, we can, you know, raise it with her. But that's the issue here, is that I think you all decided on how to manage some unresolved issues where there was still a little bit of a lack of consensus, and Lauren was not present for that conversation and did not fully understand or necessarily support that approach. So that's kind of what's going on here. It's unfortunate she's not with us yet, because she can speak for herself otherwise.
Just to say where this came from. So the strikeout over to the right that's in kind of that comment bar now, just to know. So Billy sent some comments because he was going to be gone about concerns about those. So those are in there. Then Abby and others in our meeting on last Friday raised those. So those got in there probably imperfectly in terms of my translation. And we, you know, it was our best effort, but it wasn't like a fully written out, well articulated range of opinions on these things. And so I think Lauren's concern that it was confusing is right. And I think that's why we fell back on kind of the bullet piece. Jane, John, and Abby.
Marian just dropped in the chat the CAP outline so folks can see specifically. I wanted to see the cross-cutting pathways. And I do just want to recognize that there is a section in the cross-cutting pathways around it's been refined as of yesterday, actually, as the cross-cutting pathways will sort of be split up into two areas. Pathways where the work has been done, and pathways and recognition where we know these are important components of overall climate action, workforce development, building codes, beyond other things. But one of the areas is around capacity and state government and coordination. And there will be a component of that cross-cutting pathway that speaks to the recognition and appreciation of a climate office in the state, and that work needing more work in understanding and appreciating how climate work gets coordinated at a state level. And so I do just want to mention, and maybe through this comment or how you resolve it, Lauren and her work in helping with us on the cross-cutting pathways could help speak to how this work gets lifted into that section, or if it stays here in your section and is just called back to from the cross-cutting pathways. But this is an issue and of interest from, I know in cross-sector has highlighted this, and I'm not sure Marion could probably speak to if rural resilience has, but I know it's come up repeatedly at cross-sector also. So
we've talked more about a state land use plan and rural resilience, not so much a land use office.
Yeah. Anyway, just want to highlight that there are other places in the plan that speak to this.
John and then Abby.
Mine's just a simple comment of trouble discussing this when Lauren isn't here.
Oh, you're here, yay.
Oh, sorry. Oh, okay, sorry, Lauren. Well, she is here, so I withdraw my comment.
Abby and then maybe Lauren. Okay, Abby, go ahead.
I guess what I wanted to say is just full disclosure, that meeting, we've had a lot going on the home front. And so I apologize for any sort of inability of mine to convey what happened in that meeting or what did not. And I'm afraid that that has contributed to some confusion, because for the love of me, I could not remember. And the video of that meeting is not on the website. And so I couldn't go back and sort of figure it out. And so I think it was just like one of those moments where there became a lot of confusion that likely is unnecessary and can be resolved quite quickly. And I mean, I personally am fine if we decide that this suite of options should go into the cross-cutting pathways, and that makes sense. I think I'm on board with that. I just kind of wanted to apologize for my role in not being able to convey appropriately to the parties involved what I remembered of that meeting, because I couldn't remember. So thanks.
No problem.
Yeah, I don't think you need to apologize, Abby. It's fine. I'm excited to kind of figure out what we're going to do next, because I think there's lots of great options. So Lauren, we've kind of just laid out the two options that are there, and hoping to figure out whether or not sorry, Pat, you were going to do this.
No, you're doing it. Keep going. You're doing great. Keep going.
Whether or not we try to debate this and figure it out here in our group, or pass it off to other places in the climate action plan that it could live.
So we could defer this to the council, to the cross-cutting, and just not, leave it to them to sort out, or we could try to do our work here on these two. Or we could leave it like this with a kind of vague reference to disagreement. Anybody can read that small type off to the right on screen. You have far better eyesight than I have.
Oh, yeah, so I can read it out loud, but I don't think either of the written drafts are kind of where we want to head. The one on the right here that's in the comments is what I had crafted based on what was in that last version of the matrix that had both kind of the pros and cons. And on the left is kind of where we landed with the last version that was submitted, because it was confusing to have a recommendation for and against kind of within the same place. So I don't think either of those are the way that we want to end up. I think we have to decide whether or not we recommend it or not, or all agree that it's okay to have kind of contradicting recommendations within themselves in there.
Thoughts or views about kind of how to proceed, as Alyssa just noted. What is challenging about these is they are cross-cutting. So certainly certainly rural zones has views on, say, a state central planning office. Probably everybody has views on a state climate office. Judy.
I think Patrick, old technology works if you can't read that little writing.
Look at that. I love it. Everybody, that Judy gets like, look at that. That's amazing.
My glass.
He pulled it out.
Yes.
That's great.
Would it
I
be
use-
helpful to
I
put
use
them in
it
the
all the
box?
time, Patrick, but I usually keep it out of view. But I thought maybe it's a hint I want to share with you.
You know what? I gotta go out and buy one.
I think that I would prefer to keep the fact that there's a disagreement in there because the feelings were strong about the disagreement and why. And so saying that that we want to continue to work on it, I think we should do that because it was time that made us not continue the conversation. And I think we need to consider the conversation.
One option to Judy to that point is I wonder if we could have a non-quorum group of folks kind of work on crafting this language better so that we can be more clear about where we are. Again, I think we may struggle to get to agreement here, but it would be maybe important to convey to the council the range of views and why. And I just think we haven't done that. So I don't know whether a smaller group can kind of work on crafting some views across both. What do people think? Alyssa, you just put, okay, you're just copying stuff. Great. You're copying stuff from the side note. Thank you. It's great. Okay.
Yeah, I heard that it's hard to read. So I thought if folks really want to see it and they can't read it in there, that I will just put it in here for you. Maybe it's too long to put in there.
I clearly have to go to the store after this meeting. And I think Abby asked the question, one thing is like we work on it and then it goes to somebody else and ends up being quite different by the time the council wrestles with it, just how to, how do we kind of, one is you guys kind of own this draft, right? And then also the council will do what it does with it. But what do folks think?
I guess the only thing I will share is that there's been a number of proposed strategies and actions that haven't garnered full consensus support by the subcommittee, and we have not put them forward as prioritized actions, even ones where a clear majority support them. So I guess I'm fine for there to be further discussion. I'm mindful of how much time we have left, and I'm just mindful that, many of the other actions that we've kind of left behind didn't enjoy that kind of further dialogue. So I don't feel strongly one way or the other, but just looking at how we've kind of approached our decision-making heretofore, this does seem like a somewhat inconsistent process.
Lauren.
Well, I just wanted to agree with Billy that I stand still in a place of confusion around how we ended up putting some things, elevating some things into the respective pathways and others that were not. And not just because of the confusion that I had myself around the meeting that I missed a couple of weeks ago, but seeing some things that, as Billy said, had either were ranked really high in the prioritization process that were left off, or had clear majority support, if not full unanimous consensus. And so I think our adherence to consensus has been really challenging, actually, because I think there have been oftentimes where maybe there's just like one or two people who dissent. And to Judy's point, noting that dissent, I think, is important. And I think that's even in the roadmap process for the full council to note dissent in the plan where it needs to be elevated. But it does seem strange that some things have been left off that had a significant prioritization and or support, and others are being left in. I don't know if we need to start just calling votes, just even if not to include, but just to understand where the consensus may or may not be. But right now it seems really cumbersome or confusing to follow.
Judy, over to you.
I appreciate what you're saying, Lauren. But for me, it was quite clear why some got left off. We were told every time there was a discussion on something, we were told time was the issue.
So on these two particular ones, I think we just need kind of a way forward. So we can, we can kind of discuss these now and try to like reach accommodation. We can discuss them now and have the co-chairs bring the disagreement really in their presentation about things, you know, to the, as you present to the Climate Council next week, which you can do verbally or in a slide. We can work to try to include more language somehow in our draft here. Or we can just drop these and let these get tended to in other places, which in some fashion they probably will. What the outcome will be, I have no idea.
Well, one, I'm just going to jump in. Billy and I are not presenting, so there's that.
Oh, thank you.
Two, I have had concerns about these, but I feel my concerns could just be addressed in language and or how how we frame what these things would be from our perspective. I also realize sort of the futility of that and the fact that, like, ultimately, how do I say this in the right way? Regarding these types of things, it doesn't really matter what I think or don't think, which I mean, just is what it is, I guess. So I see a pathway forward. Just, I think there are bits of language that could be incorporated that, you know, it's not that I'm against either of those things moving forward. It's just that were they to move forward, I feel they would need to be framed up in very specific ways to ensure equity and justice and environmental justice were incorporated into the management of those entities, if that helps any.
The language could read, Abby, to build on what you said, you know, D&E could say consider those two entities and then talk about some of the considerations that have to be addressed: environmental justice, equity, efficiency, whatever it is. And that would, again, it's a little weaker recommendation, but it leaves it on the plate, so to speak. Judy, I think you have your hand up.
I didn't take it down, but I do have a comment on what you just said. If I recall, a lot of what the discussion around this and the differing opinions were about having it, the Central Planning Office be under A&R. And if I recall correctly, Jane said the only thing that would be under A&R would be the budget. But of course, the budget is the determining factor on how successful this would be. And that's what the discussion was, in my mind, a lot about. So consider reviving the State Central Plan Office needs to reflect that.
Good, no, it's a good addition, thanks.
So A&R does not, A&R has control of the budget. It should not have control of the budget, was the discussion. Should not have control of anything. It should be a separate entity.
And if I remember right, just to build on that, Judy, what I heard a conversation about both D&E was actually where would they sit, and there were differences of opinion about where they would sit, and that also means the budget for sure, because that's in some ways everything.
Correct. And Jane tried to clarify where it would sit was that A&R would have control of the budget, but it would be independent. But they're not independent if A&R has control of the budget.
I may have been speaking to how the work for the Climate Council works right now, but I don't believe I spoke to this suggestion about the budget with A&R.
Okay. You think that budget issue is relevant to this Climate Office, not the Central Planning Office.
Right. And Pat, like, I strongly oppose a state planning office that's not embedded within the executive branch of state government. So this is a substantive thing where there's real disagreement. You know, I'm fine for us to explore this further, but if we're really doing a consensus-based model, I don't think there's consensus around these. So that's my only point.
Which is why the two were up, the disagreement was up there, Billy.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that, Judy. I'm not disagreeing with you. I'm just saying that these aren't maybe as far along as some folks might hope.
Right. I mean, there's a few options on consensus. You can consent as a group to just not address them. You can consent to forward a range of opinions on these, or you can consent to forward a full agreement on them, right? There's, I think, kind of three options: consent to just leave them out, consent to forward with differences, and then, or three, to try to reach resolution or agreement. Lauren.
Just two thoughts that I have. One, I hate to recommend B, develop and implement a statewide land use plan, but not leave better breadcrumbs for whoever might do that. I think part of the recommendation from either a D or an E were that those could be the people who would create that, and that would represent the different agencies, interests, and needs of the state of Vermont across all of the agencies. So just to acknowledge the fact that if that was to be developed, by whom and who would it be implemented by as well, is an outstanding question that we haven't really given to decision or policymakers. And the second point I want to make is that we're really conflating D and E in a way that I hope that we can kind of separate them. One is revival of a central planning office, which existed in state government in the past and no longer does. Another is kind of creating a space for the executive branch and or programmatic experts across the state to kind of have a landing space for them to coordinate their climate related efforts and make sure that climate change is being considered across state government and all of the different funding and regulatory programs. So those two things are very different, and the way that we're talking about them really conflates them. And I just want to be clear, as those were discussed in a couple of different groups, the intent was very different.
I think it's good to keep them separate. So co-chairs, do you want to test where the group is on each at this point? With kind of
I guess I can just put another option out there to complicate things further. There is a bill in the Vermont legislature right now that's recommending a legislatively driven study on whether and how and where to have a state planning office to kind of do the sort of analysis of options that I think was just discussed. So another alternative is just to kind of support that study at this point, if that's a viable path for folks.
So that was for land use or for the climate office for land use?
Land use planning, state planning office.
Okay.
What bill is that?
It's H306, I believe.
Thank you.
All right. What do people think about that idea that Billy just said? I don't know if people know the bill well, but it's a bill that's considering exploring
I'll post it in the link. I'll post a link to it in the chat.
David Mears. David, did you
You're
have a
still muted.
I'm trying to figure out how to make this work with my phone. Can you hear me now?
Yep, we can hear you. You're good.
I was just going to say, what Billy suggests is the very least we can do. I have my sense has been that we have consensus on the idea that we need to maintain the amount of forest and farms that we have in the state, that we need to really carefully manage how we site solar and energy and development, and that there's a statewide interest in doing that. And I cannot for the life of me fathom how anyone thinks that's going to happen without a change in governance. We need an executive branch agency to work across all the agencies to help coordinate all those decisions and to balance all those uses, to evaluate all the data, and to work with the local governments and the regional planning commissions. So I think we absolutely have to at least, explore the creation of.
Great. Judy, you're. Okay, no problem. All right, so what again for land use? What if we generally note, consider we'll figure out the language, but essentially reference the legislative language around this piece, which is, Bill, I guess it's not creating it; it's actually studying it further. Is that correct?
My understanding of what the intent of this bill is.
All right. So anybody disagree that we just reference that bill and support that in terms of further exploration of that office, Lauren?
Well, Alyssa has a real hand raised, so I'll defer.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, thank you. I didn't see her. Thanks for that. I'm only seeing.
Thank you, Lauren. I can't figure out how to raise my hand while I'm sharing my screen, so I'm just going to do that one. But yeah, I haven't reviewed the proposed legislation, and I feel uncomfortable identifying a very specific bill in this document. I think that clearly, like, if our recommendation echoes or parallels pieces of that legislation, that the people are going to pick that up and see that as a way to implement this recommendation, but I don't think we should just pick a specific bill in this case. I also just want folks to consider the modification that I made to B somewhat kind of captures the conversation, and that could, I want to suggest that as a way to resolve this. That's it.
Right. All right. So what about looking at B? What about look at the B? To Lauren's point about it needs an implementation mechanism, and then what Alyssa said is kind of offered either. What do people think about that approach? The thing that's highlighted now in blue. And maybe then we can just drop D and E because we've kind of referenced it indirectly in B. Anybody can't live with Alyssa's change to B.
I can live with this Alyssa's change to B, but there needs to be something in there addressing the location of this office. One way or the other.
If you have suggested language, just say it, Judy, I'll type it in.
Already did. A&R should not control the budget. And it shouldn't be located in A&R agency.
But you're saying, I think, Judy, what you're suggesting, it would exist in the executive, but not under any particular agency.
I don't know if it would exist in the executive branch, but I think there's A&R, my relationships with A&R has always been to make things come into compliance. There's no oversight there. And I think that we need to have a central planning office that can oversee issues that arise.
Right.
Yeah, maybe, yeah, I would support language that just says, yeah, either a single agency should not house this, or it should be its own, new entity. Something like that is fine.
Because then it avoids conflict of interest between agencies.
So also, Abby, so a single agency should not house this. And what was your or again, one more time?
Oh, or how we had it. It was always my understanding that the idea behind our recommendation of the Interagency Office of Climate was either that it would be a new entity. I assume it has to exist within the executive branch. I'm not really sure where else it could exist. And my thinking of it was that might create the ability both to bring in potentially new people who, weren't as embedded in our structures as they are. It would allow for greater potentially to bring in somebody, folks with environmental justice training, and to sort of like be able to take a more objective overview of how the government is approaching climate, and sort of bring in maybe a representative from each agency to, steward forth that process within each agency. But then it was a, to Judy's point, it's not set within the structures as they currently exist, which I think have some issues in terms of thinking about how we approach climate holistically.
Right.
I think what I'm hearing is, let me just try to get some, and I'll go to Lauren next. I'm hearing it should be cross-cutting across agencies, jurisdictions. It should have its own budget. It should be equitable. I think those are things I've heard kind of so far. Lauren, over to you.
I wonder if I can put David on the spot if he's listening. I can't tell if he's actually able to hear us. He's nodding. Okay. David, you just kind of acknowledged the fact that in order to implement a statewide land use plan that acknowledges the different values and virtues that we've kind of agreed upon via consensus in this subcommittee, at least, that we would need to address governance structure and concern. And I wonder if you have any proposed language, whether it's fully fleshed out or not, that we could put in this space.
Okay. David, I can't try one more time. We had you heard you earlier, now you're on mute. Check your phone to see if you're, might have to,
I'm a
there you
little
go.
bit handicapped by my technology. My apologies. So Yeah, I don't have any language right. I'm just not in a space to type anything, but I absolutely could come up with some language, and I definitely think that we need some way to talk about how we're going to implement all of our recommendations. Some place within state government that's going to hold all these ideas and advance them across the state agencies and across local governments. In the absence of some kind of governance structure, they're just sitting there. We can leave it to the legislature and policymakers to decide that for us, but I think it's worth taking the time to hash this through. And the comments that have been made so far suggest to me that people don't actually fully appreciate and understand how our state government works, which is fine. It's complicated, and you kind of have to be in it to know it. But it's worth taking some time to get this right.
So here's a thought, because we have other things we have to go through today. So I'm wondering whether there's a few folks who could work on language to bring forward next Friday for us to look at in this regard. Alyssa's done a great job of trying to get us closer on B, but I think there's some more work to do. So I wonder if there's a few folks who could, short of quorum, who would volunteer to kind of go back and forth the email to get to a language or a few options that we can bring forward next time. David, I think you have, I think, strong views.
I'd like to be involved in the conversation if possible.
Got David, Billy, Alyssa, since you're holding the pen, if you're willing. And
I
then
to be.
Yeah, great. I want to get someone outside of state government, so I think that's good. Okay, we've got David, Billy, Alyssa, and Judy.
Yeah, and just to kind of go back to, and we should move on, but just to go back to my initial point, there isn't a state land use plan. The state is not authorized. It has very limited kind of legal authorization to do planning at the state level. Most of that planning currently is highly technical and requires the expertise of specific state agencies and programs within those agencies. So I just don't know what this group would do. If there's a need to or an interest in kind of coordinating the activities of state government in a different way, let's have that conversation. But we don't have a state land use plan. So that's how I struggle with this right now. I just don't know what this new office would do other than add another level of kind of bureaucracy to the work of state government that's already fairly integrated, coordinated around planning efforts. Can those efforts improve? Absolutely. I just don't see the need for an additional office unless there's new legal authorities for the executive branch to do planning, which currently doesn't exist. So that's the genesis of my concern.
Maybe one last point just for clarity. Lauren, you mentioned there was a statewide Office of Planning at one point, and did they have the jurisdiction at that point to create a statewide land use plan or not?
No.
So they existed, but they did not create a statewide plan.
Yeah, that's my recollection, but Billy, correct me if I'm wrong.
I don't think there's ever been, I think the law to create a statewide land use plan either was never passed or was repealed at some point, Act 200. I don't think we've ever had one. Folks who are longer in the tooth would know better than I, but I work in what used to be the state planning office, I think, and I have a good sense of what they did, and it was largely around kind of coordination around efforts that happens in different ways now across the executive.
John Roberts' comment, then I'm going to suggest our way forward and move on for today. John?
I'm just checking how long my teeth are. I think that's Billy's got a good point. I mean, I remember this Act 200 discussion, and maybe there was a strong. I seem to recall it, but I don't recall which administration it was. It took place under, but there was very, very, very strong resistance across the state in certain areas. Times are a lot different. Billy's absolutely right. We would need a whole new legislative authority to do that. I don't think that's part of our remit in this process, but it is, it is something down the road that I would, if structured properly, I would probably support because I think it has some real benefits. But so that's that.
So I've got David, Billy, Alyssa, and Judy to kind of play further with this language in B, with kind of principles around coordination, cross-cutting, kind of its own budget, equitable, but also to Billy's point, kind of efficient and not redundant. So whether all those things can match up into something, I don't know, but I think that's, if we can leave it at that for now, and we'll see some language next Friday. Okay. Lauren, just so you know, what we suggested for some of the editorial changes that Alyssa made, she has a Redline strikeout. And Lauren, if you have further thoughts with Alyssa about some refinements of that, we thought that you and Alyssa could have that conversation offline, and people were comfortable with that, just so you know. Alyssa, you had one other thing, which was about, I think, maybe putting a strategy or two together. And then I'll come back to the concern and chat about how things got prioritized, but just, Alyssa, maybe you want to go over that last one then.
Sure. So this is something also that likely maybe Lauren and I and a couple others could just work out and bring back next Friday or circulate to everyone in a draft. So the thought was that there are a few strategies and actions that were suggested to be combined that are involve kind of river corridor, riparian areas, and wetlands. And so that's strategy 7, 8, and 9, which, strategy 8 has one elevated action, strategy 9 has no elevated actions. Maybe that'll somehow change based on our prioritization conversation that follows. But Ali suggested, and I thought was a great idea, to potentially combine those in one larger strategy with lots of actions. And so if folks have strong opinions, you can let me know now. I think it's likely something that Lauren and I and a couple others could redraft and share back. What do you think, Lauren?
Yeah, I think that's a great solution. Good idea to both you and Ali for that.
Great.
Anybody have a concern about that? Otherwise, we'll send those folks off to kind of combine and make that sync. Any concerns about doing that?
I have a question. Of course, I have a question, right?
No, ask what.
I don't have the words again. You took them down, Ali, but it said something about wetlands are carbon something. Was it neutral? Wetlands are a net carbon sink. Are you telling us that? What are you telling us with that? Wetlands are a net carbon sink.
Yeah, so that means that they uptake and store more carbon than they emit through respiration or other.
Okay,
yeah.
So here's my question then. That's what I thought it meant. So why then, when we make biomass pellets, are they considering forest and wetlands to be low grade wood to be cut to make pellets?
I don't know the answer to that question. I don't think that the grade of wood is related to the carbon storage of wetlands, but I actually, it was Billy that drafted this piece of the recommendation. And if Ali is here, she hopefully would have a more direct answer. I'm sorry that I don't know.
Ali's in the field today. She was not going to be able to call in.
So
that's my recollection.
My point is it stores a lot of carbon, yet it's a place that is being considered low grade and they need to cut.
I'm not personally aware of that policy. I think the sink part of the wetlands is not the above ground. It has a lot to do with like sediment and other organic matter captured within the like underwater and saturated pieces, but I will yield to others that potentially know more.
Charlie put in the chat, it's because the trees aren't as useful for forestry and logging and human use.
Charlie did not
yeah.
put that in the chat.
So let's let Charlie respond.
Okay, go for it, Charlie.
Yeah. I mean, putting aside all the conversations we've had about the term low grade wood, as it's currently used, all it's talking about is, from a market perspective, products are graded in terms of price differentiation, and the lower grades have a lower price differentiation in the market. And so that term, I think, is strictly, and again, not saying it's a good term or a bad term, but as it's used, the term is really strictly only talking about kind of the price differentiation in the marketplace, not anything having to do with carbon or anything else. So
So then should we be saying, I mean, we can say it's a net carbon sink, but we should be saying it shouldn't be touched then, right?
I'm not clear on what's a net carbon sink.
Well, Alyssa just gave a definition.
Are we talking about, well, I think if we're talking about wetlands or forests as systems versus an individual product differentiation coming out of the forest, I guess, I'm confused.
Yes, I want to be clear. So here, the notion of, right, for wetlands anyway, it's primarily the carbon sink exists in the muck essentially because it stores carbon. That's, I think, my understanding. And as vegetation dies and gets into that, it stores carbon, I think. There is, Judy raised.
It also has a large number of trees, which are considered high value to us because those are the trees we want for our baskets.
Right, got you. So Judy, do you want to make sure that we don't eliminate in the notion of supporting kind of wetland protection and the like, that we don't eliminate TEK or traditional uses for things like baskets and the like? Do we want to just call that out explicitly?
No, what I'm trying to say is let's keep that strong statement of wetlands are carbon sink, and let's consider it in other places, like when we're talking the harvesting of wood for biomass. Because one of the places they're harvesting is wetlands, and they're harvesting there because they're saying it's low-grade wood.
Gotcha. Okay, that's good. That's helpful. So we got to look at this in relation to this. The section we'll get to in just a second. Good. And Alyssa's adding some language you need to take a quick look at. All right, so I think Lauren and Alyssa are going to work to combine those with Ally in those sections into maybe one pathway and then one strategy and several actions. And then on the language around the state offices, David, Billy, Alyssa, and Judy are going to work to try to further refine that language. All right, anything else on pathway B? Okay. All right, pathway. There's some questions in chat from the members about how things got prioritized. So here, and co-chairs weigh in here, or Marley, as you remember. So when we had the matrix, this was the rubric. It was totally imperfect. To Judy's point, we didn't have enough time, and that I think caused it to not be a great process. We did the best we could, but I think what happened is in the matrix, we asked members who could to rank all the various actions by high, medium, or low. Some people didn't rank anything. Some people ranked only some things. Some actions got a lot of rankings by a lot of people because obviously people had views about them. Some had just a few. So again, it wasn't like everybody quote unquote voted or ranked everything. Then what we did is anything that had just fully high immediately got elevated and kept in as a priority. Anything that had sort of highs and mediums got sort of, if you remember right, colored yellow, and that stayed in. Anything that had one or more lows, if it was all high and one low, I think we left it in. If anything had more than two lows or more, we dropped it out, but for two things. When people went back through one last time and looked at those matrices, some people wrote in their final comments in the matrices, this is important to me, please elevate to a priority. And if a person asked to do that, it was. And we went through those, and anything that was referenced explicitly to TEK or explicitly to equity, regardless of how it got ranked, also got elevated as a priority. So that was a terribly imperfect system. That was the rubric behind it. I'm sure it left weird anomalies in terms of what was in or what was out, but that was the approach we used as best we could. And that got us to where we are. That doesn't mean we have to stay there. We can demote something or promote something as people see fit from the matrix. Ultimately, by the way, we'll have to coordinate the matrix in the final document, but we'll worry about that later. And everything that's in the matrix stays. We just have to make sure it's consistent with what we ended up putting in writing too. Any questions on that before I go to pathway C?
Pat, was that anybody who felt strongly about something that wasn't highly prioritized to go in and indicate? Was that part of the process from the meeting that I missed a couple of weeks ago?
I think it might have been because there was a final version of the matrix with colors in it, and people wrote some redline comments in the comment bar saying, please elevate this. And I think my guess is that's when you were in fact on. Yes, I think that's right. So I think, Lauren, to that point, it may be that if there's any, I would, because we've kind of got this somewhat stable in terms of what's in there. I hope we kind of mostly can leave that. But if there's anything that didn't get in there as an action that people feel strongly should be, it seems to me there's no reason co-chairs, unless you feel differently, we couldn't promote it into the written product.
Well, I guess I have a question then, if I can. In the last version that I had prior to that meeting that I missed, there was a separate action around net gain wetlands policy. And then it got folded into, I assume at the meeting that I missed, into a more generic conservation strategy with aspiration for net gain. And I just wonder if that conversation, if the video is now up, I think Marion said in the chat it is, I can go back and watch it, but that seems like a somewhat significant change from what we had originally discussed in different task groups.
If my memory serves me right, we had some back and forth. I don't think we had full discussion about it. I think it ended up in the writing that way. I don't think it's because we had a final discussion to clarify whether it's no net loss or essentially net gain. We talked about it, but I don't think we arrived at an answer. David Mears.
Yeah, I honestly can't remember exactly how it was resolved. I wrote that land use section, just kind of took the language from the matrix as it was on the assumption I really didn't have the authority to change it. But I would like to get the net gain back in. And the way I recalled it, it was that we were trying to merge the two provisions. But the way it ended up being merged, it's just the net gain idea is an aspiration. It's not really a recommendation that we develop a policy to advance net gain, which is different. So I would love to see that revised and back in if there's an opening to do that.
And that's a net gain for wetlands, right, Lauren? Just to make sure I'm capturing the right thing. And since we're on that, we'll go to Pathways in a second. Is there anybody who would be opposed to a net gain approach to wetlands? Ryan, hand up. Then Abby.
This is a very long and complicated conversation when it comes to how the state of Vermont regulates, defines, and enforces how land use activities can be undertaken in areas that meet the criteria of being a significant wetland that merits protection under the Vermont wetland rules. When we say a policy of net gain, looking at the current regulatory framework, it appears the only place where that net gain can come from is from active productive agricultural cropland. The current developed infrastructure that we have in the state, I don't think is a place where people meaningfully can suggest we can restore significant wetlands in parking lots or stormwater infrastructure around developed lands that are there to deal with stormwater runoff. Forest land and forests that are managed by citizens of Vermont, can have logging roads and can be logged, but the conversion to any other use is regulated, right? It can't be converted to agricultural development without a permit if there's a significant wetland present there. And so that leaves a dwindling pool of agricultural cropland that has decreased by over 200,000 acres since 1987, as in my mind being the only meaningful place to extract those net wetland gain goals. And so for that reason, I struggle with that policy to be elevated, given the fact that based on the wetland program's own report out, we have seen gains of wetland with the current state policy approach, which is no net loss. And so there is a number of reasons where we can talk about loss of wetlands. And when we talk about wetlands that are used, for example, in the carbon budget or the carbon inventory, what we're talking about are wetlands that are mapped by the state of Vermont, which are about 300,000 acres. That is one advisory layer where we find significant wetlands in the state of Vermont. Presumptions that exist based on size of land, a whole host of other criteria, bring in a whole other host of areas that require delineation to understand whether or not the land there is and does house a significant wetland. That greatly expands the scope of where, when someone wants to undertake an activity that is not an allowed use and requires a permit, for folks to do an analysis to understand if a significant wetland is present there, how they can avoid, minimize, and mitigate impacts. And so we have an incredibly protective program that is effective. And to hold on one hand, which I very much agree with as a subcommittee, talking about the interconnected values of natural and working lands together, right? They're 94% of the state, right? Let's keep a balance there, acknowledge the power that's there for sequestration and mitigation, adaptations, and resilience goals. And when we pit one of those land uses over another, which I feel the net gain language for only one of those categories, it necessarily goes against some other productive natural and working land activities. And so, you know, for those reasons, you know, I don't think, I can't come to consensus on that, you know, and happy to dig into any details. I think it's an incredibly important land use. We have a lot of protection. We have farmers protecting over 5,000 acres permanently in the Wetland Reserve Easement Program, so farmers do engage in those programs. As part of a climate action plan, I don't think this is the appropriate place to include it. I think the legislative, you know, study committee for wetlands and, you know, rulemaking that's forthcoming from DEC are important places to have that conversation. And I worry it will detract from the good work that we've been doing by pitting land uses against one another. So I really apologize for rambling on. It's just an incredibly complicated subject for which I think the policy goals that folks want to see are currently playing out in practice based on how programs are implemented. So,
and just also, Lauren asked if you mentioned some data earlier in your conversation. If you're able to share that, I think that would be helpful to Lauren to look at regarding that. It's sort of the last place to get wetlands, quote unquote, is ag land. Abby, you had a comment, and David.
I'm going to let David go first.
David.
I don't want to go back and forth with Ryan on it. I mean, I think we have, the one thing I definitely agree with him is that's complex. I disagree that the only trade-off in terms of opportunities to increase wetlands is in the area of ag land. And I also disagree that it doesn't make sense to talk about wetlands in the context of climate, because it's a double win. It's helping us to increase carbon storage and increase resilience in one fell swoop. Well, with that said, you know, we're not going to resolve that debate here. And I think I'll just make another pitch to why I absolutely agree that our common enemy from natural and working lands is development. And having, frankly, and this is a reason why we need a state land use policy, is so we can set some targets and put policies in place to implement them like this, that don't pit farming and forestry against natural systems like wetlands or floodplains. And I absolutely believe that we can do that. And when you look at the landscape, there's it's true. I mean, the one thing, Ryan, I absolutely agree with Ryan. There's certainly a lot of converted land that was converted to farmland that used to be wetlands. So it would be an obvious target, but I'm not suggesting that's where we make the target. And it's why I think, coupled with the goal of sustaining and maintaining our working lands, and including farmland, is critical. Anyway, I could ramble on too. I'm not sure how to resolve this going forward, Pat, but we're clearly not at consensus.
Abby, go ahead.
Yeah, I guess from a farmer's perspective, managing the type of ecosystem that we attempt to manage here, you know, we have multiple significant wetlands on our conservation easement. The management of those, the management of a wetland in conjunction with forest land, in conjunction with perennial pastures and wildlands, et cetera, is all a really complicated very nuanced system, and it requires, as does any ecosystem, you know, anytime a human is interacting with an ecosystem, at least the best as I can figure and how we attempt to do it here is you're always trying to achieve balance, and balance means at certain moments you're going to have to, you know, you're pulling a little bit of a thread here and you might have a slight impact here, but you're also pulling, and then you're rebalancing the thread by pulling over here, and you're always just trying to stay in stasis and maintain balance. I think what gets really tricky in the wetlands discussion is I feel I feel very strongly about both of the perspectives that are offered, but I think that unfortunately what has tended to play out in this discussion is that, as with a number of other types of things, the farmers, the agricultural lands tend to be the easy target, to David's point. And so whatever language we're putting forward, if we can attempt to address, you know, that we see the potential in the strategies and actions we've offered here to learn more about and sustain and grow our understanding of how farm systems can manage ecosystems functionally, and that we see opportunity to gain wetlands, I'm sure both in farmland, but that's a tricky thing, and then in other places. I think that that's okay. I just know that from the farmer's perspective, there comes a point where it feels like you constantly are working with a target on your back, and it feels impossible. And the regulations and the burdens and the fees and the permitting are a lot. We have had to not do things that would be better for our land overall and the impact that the animals have and things like that, because of the wetland regulations and because of the fee structures. It's very complicated. So I just think whatever we're putting forward, we need to do what David is suggesting at the very least, in balancing that we're not trying to say we want to see our agricultural production capability reduced by a net wetland gain policy, I guess. I don't know. I'm just feeling like I have to say from the farmer perspective some of what goes on there, because it's really complicated.
So a question, I'm not sure this is right, but I tried some language in the chat that says essentially develop and implement a net gains wetlands policy with a focus on net gains on non-working lands and carefully manage the balance of working and natural lands, which all are essential for sequestration and storage to meet Vermont's climate goals. So it's trying to parse this a bit. Judy.
What are you calling non-working lands?
I don't know. That was my best effort at something. Good question.
Because I would consider wetlands working lands. They're a virtual grocery store.
Maybe I could be explicit and just say ag lands. Maybe that's the better phraseology. I don't know how, with Judy's addition, I don't know what people think about that, as whether that gets closer or it's still not. We're just not there.
I'm not trying to be outspoken on this, but I think the middle part of what you suggested, the balance of working lands and some of the discussions about land use planning, I think those points are very well made and supported by the committee. And I would think focusing our efforts there are productive. Should that policy recommendation become a clear win absent any equity issues, that's great. But I struggle with that framing, given the practical implementation of a number of the clear challenges I think Abby shared, but are also broadly felt across a number of different sectors, that at this time it would be not in our. I don't think including net gain wetlands over other natural and working land uses is the right framing at this time from my perspective.
Okay, so I think Billy Wiseman wants to do a time check too. So I think we're not in agreement. So the reason the language got written as it is because of that. So I think that's where we are. I guess the question is there any other work we can do on this right now? And then I'm gonna do a time check. Any other questions on that for now? I think that's Lauren, over to you.
Well, I guess I'm probably getting ahead of myself, but the steering committee is having a special meeting this afternoon where we're talking about how to get to December 1st, which we're quickly careening towards. I'm sure we're all kind of feeling. And a proposed solution on the table for discussion is acknowledging that some ideas need further discussion. And if we don't have time to get to them between now and December 1st, there might be an opportunity to include it as a provisional action with an understanding that over the course of the next several months before the final version of the initial climate action plan, Jane, tell me if that's the right phrasing for that, which I think we're aiming for in March. This might be one such policy that we want to continue discussing as a subcommittee afterwards, if that's what the steering committee and climate council agreed to anyway. In the absence of doing that, this is where I guess the consensus-based approach is rather frustrating because there are very clearly like strong opinions on both sides. And strong opinions in the negative means that anything that we don't have unanimous support on gets pulled. So in the absence of the steering committee deciding on that, which I think is the better approach and affords us opportunity to have better, deeper conversation over the next several months. I mean, I'm inclined to like call a vote, which I know we're trying to avoid, but just saying.
David. And again, Billy is just reminding me wisely of time. We have some other things to go through. So let's try to be efficient in our comments. David Mears.
Just open another possible can of worms, but one of the pieces of language that I put, since we're on the net gain question, I added some language to that provision that was in the version I sent to Marion and Jane that included basically doing a better information collection so that we would have data to use to have these kinds of conversations. So I don't have that language right at my fingertips, but it just relates to this. And I was hoping that was sufficiently neutral language in the sense of it wasn't promoting one policy or another. It was just suggesting that we collect information at the state level that would help inform decisions about what's the right balance of targets for various land use.
Ryan, over to you. Sorry.
I would definitely support the collection understanding. I think this is a robust conversation. There's a lot of data points that can be shared that explicate why there may be unintended consequences to that policy for a number of the goals that are articulated in the Global Warming Solutions Act. But to bring it back clearly to what I think I hear Lauren sharing, which I think that the subcommittee has broad consensus on a number of actions, both within the agricultural mitigation section, within Pathway B, and then within adaptation resilience, which elevates wetland restoration specifically, for which there are agricultural specific programs which are elevated and highlighted, for which we've seen over 5,000 acres of farmers permanently retiring wetlands in the NRCS Wetland Reserve Easement Program, and for which the current state rules prohibit the conversion of other land that is a significant wetland to agriculture without a permit from DEC and potentially Army Corps and also USDA, right? There's 3 overlapping regulatory frameworks that protect wetlands that are not managed by agriculture at this point in time. I think we have significantly protective rules in place, other federal agencies that oversee it, and just an elevation of those complementary programs that support restoration. And so I'm happy to continue to discuss, but I don't think, I think elevating the strategies as they are currently represented in the draft plan is my preferred way to go about it.
All right, so we don't have agreement. To Lauren's point, we can certainly take a vote on the kind of the net gain question. I think we're all agreed there should be no net loss. That's probably already in state law already anyway, but I think there's agreement on that. So we can certainly do a provisional vote, Lauren, if you want, just to see where people are, to see how the split is if you want. And Lauren, if you want to call vote, we can do that. It's up to you.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'd just be interested in knowing where the committee stands on it, because it seems like there are a handful of people with strong voices on two separate sides of it, and acknowledging John's comment in the chat that this conversation and various rules around it have been under review for a very long time, which I can totally appreciate, and acknowledge that we don't necessarily have that same time afforded to us to make any big decisions. But a response to that would be twofold. First, we're not really able to make many decisions. We're just making recommendations that these policies potentially be developed by an entity either through rulemaking or legislation. And the second being, given what I anticipate to be pretty significant land-based pressures, especially with respect to changes coming to meet our emissions reductions requirements, I'm reticent to not focus on how we can protect our land resources to include agricultural land, when we know those changes have to come very quickly, because we have milestones in statute that are as early as 2025 and 2030. So if we continue to avoid land use planning, wetland gain, or no net gain policies, I think we're going to miss a really important timeline for ourselves.
I'm just, this is a provisional vote just to check where people are. So I'd ask only, of course, climate council members, subcommittee members to weigh in. And I think if you could use, let's just do your visually thumbs up because I can see everybody. So if you are a member, make sure your screen's on, and anybody who would support a net gain wetlands policy, please put your thumb up so I can see who it is. So I've got Judy, David, Lauren, Iris, Charlie. I don't know what your hand up means.
Yeah, I just want to clarify, because we've talked about a whole bunch of stuff and now we're jumping back to something very specific, but like very nebulous about a net gain wetlands gain policy. So are you saying we would support putting in just standalone text supporting a net wetlands gain policy, but without any of the other context we've talked about?
I'm asking very specific. I'm not going to give it any clarification. Do you support a net gain wetlands policy or not? Because we tried to come on language, we weren't successful. So I just want to kind of know where people are on a pretty stark question. This isn't a final vote. This is just a provisional vote. And if Charlie, you feel like you can't vote, you can, say that. All right. So I've got David, Iris, Lauren, Judy, and Charlie. Okay. And then how many folks, just so I'm clear on the count here, how many folks do not support a net gain wetlands policy? Do not support a net gains wetlands policy. Got John, Charlie, Ryan, you've advocated not for it, so I'm assuming it's a thumbs up.
I mean, I just don't think it's the right. I mean, can we abstain? I just don't think it's the right policy at this time. I mean, if you, yeah. I mean, if I'm not saying no, it's not the right time for it. If people need vetting, but if you want to put people on side, sure, I'll say at this time I would not support the inclusion of that language in the climate action plan if that's what's asked. But the question is, do you support net gain of wetlands? Of course I support net gain of wetlands. I'm not supportive of that specific language around net gain of wetlands in a climate action plan at this time.
All right.
That's what I would agree to.
All right.
Yeah,
I would like to butt in and say, I mean, I like Ryan. I'm not voting against net gain. We are gaining wetlands at 400 to 500 acres a year under our present policy and through NRCS. So I'm very reluctant to go on record as saying my vote is against net gain, because it isn't that. I am very concerned about present policy, which allows development to pay a permit fee and sort of offsite their problem to somewhere else. It's sort of like buying carbon credits from forests in, the Green Mountains to offset your coal plant or your biomass plant, to put it in a more relevant basis. So I'm very uncomfortable. I don't wish to be painted as opposed to wetlands. I'm definitely not. So this is just makes me uncomfortable, but I'm not happy with going down this road at this point.
Okay, so co-chairs, we got to kind of move on from this topic. So I think in terms of, if I ask a start question, well, yeah, go for it, Billy.
Can I just, I support this concept. I don't know exactly what it means. I wasn't able to really vote when you're voting. I was dealing with stuff here. So I'm in support of the concept of net wetland gains. As others, I don't exactly know what the net wetland gains policy means, but I'm supportive of this concept.
So I think what Lauren's suggesting is this is an issue that needs further discussion, that it's not that people are against net gain, it's that there are concerns about where the net gain comes from, I think is the point. So I think at this point, I wonder if David, you've heard enough, you could recraft or think a little bit about the language we have in the land use section on this, and maybe do some more further finessing. And we leave it to David to see if he can pull the good threads together to look at next time, or some other approach. Abby, just as co-chair, I'm going to go to you next. Abby, go ahead.
I just wanted to echo that. Can you hear me?
Yeah, you sound good now. Yeah.
I just wanted to echo that I can't vote on this right now. I don't have, to Alyssa's point, this is very pertinent, a very pertinent vote for me. I am the farm and forest sector representative to the Vermont Climate Council. And so without fully understanding what the potential ramifications are to the breadth of natural and working lands, wetlands, ag lands, forest lands, I don't feel like I can knowledgeably enough vote and go on record as voting one way or another without knowing what the ramifications potentially are to any of those bodies of land, particularly as a person, I'm just going to continue to say this, who consciously stewards all three all the time. So that's where I'm at. We can table it for now, but I refuse to take a vote on something that I don't know what the fallout will be to any of those three categories of land.
Thanks, Abby. Ryan, and then Alyssa, then we're gonna move on some fashion. Ryan.
Just, I'm not sure this body is the right mechanism to vet and evaluate this this question. Certainly a lot of expertise here, but there is an incredible amount of background with how that would be implemented, whether through the current land use regulatory framework that we have, or individual permitting. That I have not had a chance to go through the 3 to 4 different sides of the conversation and talk about what the implications are, so people can, I think, fully understand what the impact of that statement means given the current regulatory framework in the state. And so I am just reiterating that I don't think it's appropriate to even raise as a provisional. I think research and study is where we've couched a lot of our controversial or disagreements, and I'm all for studying and understanding what the current state of wetland gain is in Vermont, and what the implications of that policy would be depending on how it's implemented. I think there's a lot of maladaptive or adverse impacts that would happen for a lot of the goals we've talked about in this climate action plan development process for Ag and Ecosystem Subcommittee. So just even as provisional, I'm struggling to support that. Thanks.
Alyssa.
Yeah, I think I will echo a lot of what's been said, but I don't support including that recommendation at this time. And I think, I look at this as like a budget, right? Say you've got a limited budget to fit everything in. You cannot, I would love to increase wetland acres in the state and forest acres in the state and riparian area But we know that there's like a limited amount of land. And if we hope to increase all of the kinds of land uses that working land uses that are under the purview of our subcommittee, there's just like a limit, right? And so unlimited growth from any sector, I think, is kind of a bad policy to look at for the long term. And I think I need a lot more information on what that means and where that comes from. And so I'll stop because it's all been said before, but I'm not against wetland gains. I just don't think it's a good policy for us to recommend without knowing the full implications and where that comes from, especially in light of residential land increasing.
Great, Judy.
I'm kind of concerned that we keep kicking down the road and sitting on the fence on certain issues. And so maybe we could do a simple recommendation that we disagree, but we want this topic to be brought up in the future. Because we can't just keep kicking down the road difficult topics.
Judy, to that point, David Mears, I'm wondering whether, given all the comment, David, you could kind of fold in some of the thoughts in here, and we would look at that recommendation and figure out what we can and can't say to that end that Judy has said, reflecting the concerns and needs further exploration and the like. And so, David, I wonder if we can, in some ways, turn the writing back to you to think about the range of views that were expressed today, and see if there's some modifications you want to make to our draft. Okay, so David, this is thank you. Going to fall back on him and with Judy's good thought about how we can maybe recognize disagreement, but want to kind of keep it on the table in some way as we go forward. Okay, Billy, I want to do a time check. It's 11. I know there's one thing on Pathway C we want to. I know that we need to come. I need to kind of address around biomass to raise. There's a piece on education we want to cover, and I don't know about other things as well. So, Billy, I want to do a time check. What do you think about how we proceed?
Yeah, I think that's fine. I think we need to really focus on the named outstanding items at this point. I know there's a desire to kind of pull up unresolved things, but these are the ones that we know are unresolved. So I think we need to focus on those right now. That's my perspective. And I think, yeah, and we've got public comments so that we need to fit in.
Okay. So I think I've got Pathway C, education, and Lauren wants to talk about cross-cutting, which is good. Lauren, you raised that, so for sure. So we've got, let's try to do those three, and then maybe we'll take a break, we'll do public comment and see where we are. And we need to take a little time to think through where to from here. Okay, so on Pathway C, which is the one I wrote, I think the one topic we need to touch base about, and as C is the kind of the last strategy was around biomass. And there was a lot of hard work by Charlie and Judy and Abby and others to go back and forth on that topic. So I can put up what's in the current draft now and want to just see if again, there's a lot more we don't know, a lot more people could cite studies. Given the time, I'm not sure that we can do more than we've done here, but we can test that. So I just want to put this up so people can see it. And then I just want to kind of see where we are with this one. This is again, let's see here. Okay, so can people see my screen okay? So we've got the strategies address biomass for thermal heat regarding climate mitigation, co-benefits, and its impacts. There's a definition at the top. It's not in the short summary document, but it's in the full written document just for clarity. And then there's several activities. One is prohibit expansion of current and any new large-scale facilities, and we already consented on that several meetings ago. The next one is essentially if they can't be improved in terms of their impacts on adjacent neighborhoods and generally their emissions, then they need to be essentially closed, but address the worker implications of that. C is really trying to understand this complexity of accounting for biomass, and Judy and Charlie and others had a really rich conversation. And the idea is that research first is to really understand what it means for Vermont forests, for the trade-off between using it for heat, and as well as for then forests for sequestration and storage. And so that research is really important because there was a lot of back and forth, a lot of articles people shared. So that's an essential and kind of important step. Another important step, D, is to ensure appropriate regulation of these facilities, particularly their source wood or their source product. And then E is saying if research justifies, further advancing biomass and there's appropriate oversight, then essentially the recommendation is to support biomass in kind of the smaller scale, schools, institutions, whatever, understanding that it also provides benefits to landowners and foresters in that piece. And then lastly, it raises the question, particularly of the regulation and flow of wood pellets, and whether it's an international market, a regional market, a local market, ensuring that we're, not sort of destroying our own forests or other forests for this end. So that is the recommendation that got kind of carefully crafted through a lot of discussion. Charlie.
We just a quick clarification. Do we have this as a separate document? I want to be able to read this at my own pace. So can you put this either in the chat, or is this already in a document that we received?
It's in the document. It's in
Okay.
Pathway. It's under Pathway C, which is in the sequestration and storage.
Great. Thank you.
The very last strategy.
Thank you.
Charlie and Judy.
Yeah, I just had, I do think we have an opportunity to maybe refine the language in here a little bit better. Beyond that, because we haven't had time to dig into that as a group, just two quick housekeeping things. In the document, as you scroll down to like E, as it references B, I do think we need to just double check. Like, I think the B there should actually be C.
Gotcha.
Like in E, B in paragraph E, the B should be C. And I think there's one other spot. But either way, we just need to make sure that we're referencing the right sections if we're going to go with what's written.
Nope, good point. Judy.
Yeah. Could you go up to B?
Yeah, I didn't maybe get you up there. Yeah, right there.
I think it needs to say on footprint on adjacent neighborhoods, communities, and the land, because they're impacting archaeological sites as well as the health of the land.
I'm gonna put it in caps so I can keep track of it. All right, so to Charlie's point is you got to make sure the reference points are right. 2 is Judy Wade. We can add the and the land.
Okay, and C, I think we have submitted plenty of research. I think that that here we needed more definitions and more comments. I mean, I definitely did not agree to small scale benefits, only because I felt that the systems we have in place need to be monitoring how biomass is achieved. And with looking at the comments that Ally gave us, most of it's coming from out of state. So if it's coming from out of state, do we know that it was harvested economically or sustainably? Sorry. And so I'm not supporting low grade at all. You just put that in there.
So Judy, just to be clear, which are you not supporting?
Small scale. At this, I'm not supporting small scale. I gotta plug my computer in, it's red, just a second.
No problem. And the intent of C is the research would inform that, to see trying to differentiate it from the large scale. It's the support language goes, Judy, I was just saying and this may be a wording issue, is C is just about research, and the research is to inform small scale if it even makes sense. It's not saying it makes sense, it's just the research is focused on the small scale to differentiate from the big scale. And then
Right.
to your point,
You left out the component that I had about where exporting and importing of bioproducts.
that is supposed to be, that's intended to be F, which maybe needs to get moved up closer to the top.
Ally addresses that as well. There was a huge amount in her letter that said it was coming from out of state in Canada. We don't know how that's being harvested. We don't even know if it's being harvested in a sustainable way.
And that's the intent of F, is to get at precisely that. Maybe it's not well written, but that's the intent of F, to what you just said.
We also have to clarify that Ally's email pertained to pellets. Much of these systems that are being discussed here are chip fueled heat plants, And most of the chips that are going to those plants are coming from Vermont or adjacent states. So we need to be
Billy,
precise about our language.
thank you, Billy, but I was talking about pellets.
Okay, thank you.
We've already discussed large scale, which is chips, right?
Well, some of these thermal applications for communities and schools and things of that nature that don't produce any electricity are fueled with chips.
Mhm. All right, so I'm addressing the sustainability of all of this, and I had a definition of sustainability in here and how it was designed to harvest for pellets. And I think we can find one for wood chips as well, because they're out there. There's a lot of documents out there. And there's a lot of research. That's why I don't understand why you're asking for additional research. Are you asking for additional clarification? Are you asking that this committee have more documentation? There's lots of research out there.
Judy, my sense was there was not agreement about what all the research said or meant, and that's why it's left in there. I'm not taking a position. It just, when I heard different people talk, it seemed like there was not agreement. So that's why further research would be needed to clarify.
If there's not agreement, that means we need more research.
That's one way it's one way to do it. Yes, it may not be the right way to do it.
No, it seems like let's kick it down the road again.
Charlie.
I agree with I think what Judy's saying about, I think we do have information enough at least to be a little bit more detailed in kind of what we're talking about. Because I do think that we're on the same page around, import, export issues and how these markets would relate to any change in harvest levels, given, shifts in markets and their impact on harvest levels in the state. So, I do think we can rewrite this in a way that's a little bit more clear in terms of what are the metrics that we're looking at and how we would see them as being, important things. So you can be more granular than just a broad brush of do more research. And I would be, I didn't have time to fully flesh this out. I've got a track changes document going, an attempt to this, but I'd be willing to keep working on this to get it into some more granular detail that addresses some of the stuff we're talking about.
Check Judy's willingness to do that too. Judy, would you be willing to, as you and Charlie have done, is continue to? Awesome. Okay, so we're going to do, we had a few changes here, correct the letters, add the and land, and then Charlie and Judy are going to take this and further refine it. Okay. If anybody has comments, get those quickly to Judy and Charlie so they can consider those as they do their work. Okay. All right, great. Thanks both. That's great. Terrific. And what I'll do, guys, is I will extract this from the document to send you this version just by itself as a Word document, and then you can take it from there. Okay. Great. All right. Let's see. Let me go down here. Let's see. Judy, you had some suggestions about language in the education section. So let me just get out of this thing. So we should talk about that too. And Judy, you want me to share the language you suggested on the screen? Okay, all right, so bear with me a second. So this would go into this was in the education section, which is now cross-cutting. So here we go. Let me just share this. All right. So Judy, do you want to say a little bit more about this language? I mean, there was a version of it that was in sort of earlier emails as people were going back and forth.
Well, I'm concerned about the language that Vermont agencies are using and that it's outdated and it's also not equitable. And so I suggested a plan to update the language on various agencies so that it was more equitable. And if we were using an equitable language, then it would help the climate change recommendations that we're proposing.
So people take a look at this and see if there's comments or questions.
Sorry, can you just refresh one more time? Where would this end up?
This would end up in it would end up in the education section.
Okay.
which was then going to, what did you call it? Cross-cutting.
Exactly.
So my goal for putting these two readings in here is one was written in 1913 and another is written in 2013, and there's similarities between time.
Thoughts or comments on this? Charlie.
I like the intent here in the strategy. I just, my only comment would be, I don't know if there's a way that we could rework the strategy to kind of look a little more broadly at just kind of like, and I'm not, this isn't finalized language, but like the artifacts of the, you know, the historical evolution of our, you know, current working lands, you know, vocabulary, because I think there's other things that we can point to too. And I do worry that like, if we specifically call out low-grade wood and eugenics, it's going to be, it might not be interpreted right. Because I think there's a larger thing we're talking about here than just those two things. And I just want to make sure that if we do look at kind of this bigger conversation, that we capture it in a way that people understand it when they read it, I guess. I remember, I mean, I had a class at UVM that was like all about this. It was looking at like the two different stories basically of conservation, and you had like the European, you know, white supremacist evolution of it, and then you had a parallel one. And I'm not having fully formed thoughts right now, but I think there's a way that we could make this into more of a broader like cultural shift around natural resource management. And that might be,
well, I'm not,
anyway.
I would love to see the shift you're talking about, but I would also like to see state agencies use appropriate language.
Yeah, and maybe the vocabulary one is like an action under a strategy that's broader. Again, I just go back to, I think these are going to be things that are much kind of bigger conversations that we have to have that are going to take more time. And I just want to make sure if we're going to set the table for that, we do it in a way where people read it and kind of understand, you know, what we're doing and what we're talking about. Because the downfall here would be that if we don't do that, people are going to look at it and be like, I have no idea what that means, and just kind of keep moving.
So I want to see if we'll talk about the next step here in a second. Anybody else want to add thoughts on this right now? And then we'll talk about how to move it forward. Abby.
Yeah, I'm trying to think about how we, to Charlie's points, you know, this is work that is ahead of us, right? You know, particularly in the framework of environmental justice and repairing historical harms and injustice and trying to heal trauma. You know, the acknowledgement of the history of how we've come to be where we are is really important, and I think is going to be, I see, a necessary component of how we move forward if you know, as we're pursuing what I hope will become a just transition to, you know, in the face of a changing climate. For me personally, so like I read Calling the Herd and I go, okay, well, we do call our herd. So, you know, farming therefore would be considered eugenicist as well. And I think that, like, in terms, I'm just not sure the best way to frame this to do justice to the need to move forward in a reparative way, and also to bring folks who are working in these sectors along with us, I'm not sure how to balance those two factors. I worry about what will happen if we, people are at different places in their own learning and can hear or absorb different terms, in different ways, which doesn't change the fact that this is accurate historical context and needs to be addressed. And that's what I wrestle with a lot, is how do you balance the need to address these things, the need to encourage learning and training and further education without shutting people off the first few words that they read. Some people, when they read the word, that you're tying eugenicists into the farm and forest sectors, aren't going to move forward with education. And I'm never sure what we do with that. It's not right. It's not right to ignore the harm and trauma and historical context of how we are where we are. We also need people to come along with us in the learning. And those are the things that are, I think, really, really complicated. And I'm not sure how to address within the context of what we're talking about.
Well, it's my understanding that we're supposed to be putting forth recommendations. And as Billy has been so frequently saying, facts are fact. And here we go. We got facts here and nobody wants to own up to it. We've got to discuss it if there's going to be equity in this. So there's got to be some kind of recommendation that goes forward.
So I think the question is, I think, is what are the refinement we have to do to this to, just Judy said, so it's a recommendation. So one option is if you can take that to see if you can craft this a little bit further. I think it's important to try to include in some fashion, point stated. History is what history is. We don't, we can get in debate over that, but they're, probably basic facts that could be cited. So what are people's thoughts about proceeding here? Charlie, you had some ideas about maybe a bit of a broader frame about a shift in conservation while still keeping the specific words that Judy's asking about, language and training and the like. Charlie and Judy, you guys are working on the biomass. I don't know if you want to take this one on too, or somebody else wants to try to finesse this, or the like. So, Abby, I don't know what role you want to play in this, given that I know there's many things you're trying to juggle.
Well, just so you know, Abby, you and I've talked about this before. Culling the herd is about plants and trees and forests.
Sure, but I mean, the parallel tracks, granted, like you and I have talked about, I select for biodiversity, but there's a range of how different people approach. Anyway,
so
here's what I think I need to say. I don't know that this is really critical, what we're talking about here. If we mess this up, when we mess these conversations up, or our ability to move forward or not, we create harm in multiple places. And I'm not sure, I don't even know if we have the ability at this table to navigate this in a way that's not going to create more harm. I don't know what we do with that. I have been grappling with that for a long time. So I don't know, Pat. This is not my area of expertise. I do not know the right way forward to honor all of what we have to hold in this regard.
So in terms of way forward, because I know David's about running out of battery. He has one thing he wants to address, and I want to get to Lauren before we do public comments. So one option, Judy, is totally up to you, is I can work with some of you to try to do this. Judy, if you want to hold the pen and take comment from people and do a revision. Judy, what's your preference for how to proceed?
I want to see it move forward whichever way works best. I don't mind getting comments from folks that they want to add. I don't mind that at all. So that you understand though, I've sent this to a policymaker a person who writes policies, and she's edited it. So I don't know what to add.
Well, why don't we, Charlie, go ahead, then I want to talk about a next step on this one.
Yeah, I'm just, and these are like not fully formed thoughts, but like, again, I think if the strategy can basically be a strategy that kind of says like our current systems of natural resource management are, built upon a foundation that was heavily influenced by, fill in the blank, all the negative stuff we know got us to where we are. And as such, as stewards of those resources, we need to kind of reassess how we're doing this. And then below that, as an action, could be, acknowledging that the vocabulary that we use as part of the management of these systems, can be problematic when tied back to, XYZ. I go back to like, if we're going to have the conversation, I think, which is a good one, we need to make sure that we're clear about the broader picture we're talking about, to get to Abby's point about, I think if we dig right into something really specific right out of the gate, it can turn people off. And so trying to be as explicit as possible around kind of, we're talking about a paradigm shift, like a massive one, and then try to narrow down kind of like, okay, so vocabulary is a part of that, and here's what we have to think about in terms of some changes there.
Vocabulary and philosophy are a part of it, because you
and
stewardship, which
I know
means
stewardship is, it's a lot like it, and I know, and again, I go back to the fact that I don't have a vocabulary.
Sorry to interrupt, but I think what I'm going to suggest is Judy's going to hold the pen. If people could give her comment in the next few days, so that she can make revisions as she sees from hearing people's ideas, Charlie, including yours. So I think just maybe putting down on paper your concept, anybody else. And then what we can do is bring next Friday, then we can take a look at whatever revision might have happened. So I think Judy's been willing to do that, I think, take consideration. Billy.
Yeah, I was just going to say I support an effort to figure this out. I think this is an important time to get our language aligned with our goals and values, and to correct these past harms. So I support you all in doing this work. So thank you.
All right. Jane, quick question. I want to get to David Mears because he's about to run out of his phone charge, and we have one issue he wants to raise, and then we're going to go to Lauren. So Jane, go ahead.
Just a quick question about, and would love all of your advice on this. The education pathway is intended to be lifted up to the council on Tuesday as part of the cross-cutting issues section. And so we'll leave this section out to be added at later date once language is agreed upon. I just want to understand the process for that, since the document will be lifted up.
Can we hold up, Judy, go ahead.
why don't you leave it in and people can get me comments this weekend, and I'll get back to you on Monday.
When do you have to post that, Jane, that document?
It'll go with the rest of them Tuesday night, Wednesday morning.
Okay, so we'll work on language and try to get it to you by the time it goes up. Charlie.
But just to be clear, if the draft we were just looking at is going to be advanced to the council, can we just put, I don't want to say a disclaimer on it, but like something that's very clear that this is a work in progress that we're working through, just because other people look at this stuff and read it. And I'm just saying, like, I've had multiple people reach out to me this week being like, what's going on with low grade wood and eugenics? Which is great. It's starting a conversation, but like, other people read things and interpret things differently. And so if we're going to put that forward, I just want to make sure that it's clear that it's not, a fully baked thing yet.
Yeah, and I would like to make it perfectly clear too, Charlie, that on numerous occasions, when you've reached out to people, you've come back to us and said, I'm worried about losing my job when this is all done.
That was more of a joke, Judy.
You said it more than once. You've said it more than twice.
So let me just note this. So I think if people give comments to Judy, I think you have to get.
I'm self-employed. I'm not going to lose my job.
I'm gonna.
If I keep doing this work, I might.
The time taken away from that might.
There you go. And then again.
All right. So let me just. So Judy, I think it sounds like trying to get to Jane, sort of whatever revisions that you want to make with people's input by Tuesday. Certainly put a caveat, this is a work in progress. We'll have to look at the language as a whole group next Friday. So it will be provisional in that sense. Okay. David, over to you before you lose your phone charge. One issue you wanted to raise, and Lauren, I've not forgotten you. We're going to come to you next.
Yeah, thanks, Pat. And I'm not sure if this is an issue or not. but I did include language, as we talked about at our last meeting, in the land use pathway that describes the idea of doing regional enhanced energy planning to kind of emphasize the importance of that work in the context of our overall land use planning for renewable energy. So I just wanted to flag for people that language is in there. I didn't get any comments negative around it, but I also know that this process isn't always clear to everyone. So I just wanted to flag that language is in there. And if there's a need for conversation or discussion, we should have that.
Good. And again, that was around kind of the renewable siting question vis-a-vis, sort of natural and working lands. And David, we did, people seem to converge on it mostly last time when we talked, but it's in there. And we're going to talk in a little bit about how to kind of finish up review of these full documents outside of the issues we've talked about today in a bit. And so this could be one people could take a look at.
Great.
Thanks for putting it on the table. Okay, Lauren, over to you about cross-cutting and land use.
Yeah, I'll try to be brief. So a handful of counselors have formed a cross-cutting themes group, acknowledging the fact that we've kind of all been working on our siloed subcommittees, and that several of the strategies and actions that we've created in those separate subcommittees have a lot of implications on the other, or there's a lot of redundancy. So this group formed to kind of identify those themes and opportunities to elevate strategies and actions that we've come up with in our subcommittees to a cross-cutting group that doesn't necessarily just fall under the purview of cross-sector mitigation, but that it touches down in rural resilience, ag and ecosystems, and vice versa. And looking at that, we identified a handful, and the thing that seemed to be elevated the most was the issue area of compact settlement and the opportunities to merge different actions and create a combined set of strategies from rural resilience and adaptation, who has quite a few around compact settlement, as you can imagine. We have 3 or 4 recommendations regarding compact settlement, and there are several, especially with respect to transportation from cross-sector mitigation around compact settlement. So the recommendation from that group of counselors is that we pull out the respective compact settlement actions into a separate section of the plan. Section 15, I think, Jane, if that sounds right, let me know. So it would be right after the ag and ecosystem section, cross-cutting themes, and then compact settlement would leave that. So I just wanted to, 1, acknowledge that I've been having those conversations, and 2, make sure that this subcommittee is okay with our compact settlement strategies being pulled and put in that section of the plan, since they really do that idea in general for land use and land use planning really does touch down outside of just ag and ecosystems purview. So that's the first ask. And the second ask is for your permission, with me obviously coming back to you all and keeping you in the loop, that if any of the wording of ours changes in order to mesh with the other subcommittees, that I have the authority to do that, provided I come back to you all and let you know that that's minimal changes would be happening. And Jane, if that doesn't appropriately capture the conversation we had yesterday, let me know.
And Lauren, I think that's mostly pathway F, which is land use, and then strategy 1, which is promote and incentivize compact settlement and reduce forest fragmentation. I think either most or all of those actions then would go into this cross-cutting, I think.
Yeah, those that expressly identify compact settlement as a strategy would be removed and put into the compact settlement pathway.
Billy.
I appreciate the need for that, and I'm generally good with it. I'm just a little bit, and this may just be kind of insecurity, but I'm a little wary of taking important strategies and actions out of these sections that we're responsible for, and implying that we might not have, as a group, kind of developed them. So I just wonder if there's some way to bring them over to the cross-cutting sections, but retain some sort of reference or indicate in these original sections that the work has been done but is moved elsewhere, just so that it doesn't make sense to have them in both places, but just to create some sort of crosswalk so it's clear it wasn't an omission in these sections. Given
a step ahead of me, I meant to include that. I do think I would make a recommendation that we create some language in our subcommittee at the front end of the land use pathway, acknowledging compact settlement actions arose as a key strategy for protecting and conserving land and acknowledging land use pressures. So I would definitely want to include that language that the subcommittee talked about that and identified it as a key value, and that for the actions that were developed, please see this section. And hopefully, maybe not in December 1 version, but in a later version, there can be like a hyperlink, so it'd be easy to jump from one to the other.
Billy, does that help address your concern?
Yeah, I think that's all I'm looking for.
And Lauren, are you able to meet with that group such that you come back to this group with kind of where things are landing by next Friday? What's the sense of timing for that one?
Yeah, I can provide an update to this group next Friday. And I'm also, so that doesn't fall on David as the primary author for land use, I'm happy to offer up the language that I would recommend acknowledging compact settlement in the front end of that section.
That'd be great. Thank you. That'd be super helpful. Okay, any other questions on that for now? Okay, so Billy, I think, and Abby, we need to do public comment and then talk about where to from here. So
do we want to talk about pathway G? I know that had been on the agenda.
Yes, Iris, definitely. I want to make sure we got Judy's point on pathway G. And do you have, Iris, other things you want to raise or discuss? Thank you for raising that.
Sorry, yeah. We did change around the language of the actual actions. So I think that that's important to note, just because I know that that is something that has come up as a concern for subcommittee members. So we did change some of the language just to incorporate TEK and just make sure that it's more equitable. And then a lot of the actual writing got changed because that was some relatively poor writing on my part. So that, I don't know, I didn't see if that had been posted. Jane, is that it? It was posted. Okay. So I would just love to take any comments or thoughts, because there are some changes to the actual action language and some of them have some substance. So yeah, I'm happy to share screen if that's what people want.
People want to share screen now? People want to take a look at that and come back next time? What's the preference? Iris, thanks for raising that directly.
Yeah, if people are happy with it, I'm also good to just move on to the next thing. So yeah.
What's people's preference?
I would just suggest that we try to accomplish as much as we can today. So I think if there are some decisions we can make to help Iris move forward, we should try to use some time to do that.
Iris, do you want to, I think you want to share your screen and maybe just point out some of the more major changes. That's awesome. Thank you.
Okay, am I sharing? Yeah, I think I am. Okay. Sorry. Let's see. There's a lot of edits, obviously. I think that maybe focusing on the ones that are to the actual strategies is probably more important. I mean, the actions, sorry. So the first one is just, Judy was wondering if it could be changed to institutions of higher learning versus UVM, because there are other organizations that can do that work. I didn't draft this action, so I would maybe like to hear about that, because that's a pretty substantive change. And then there was a comment from Marley just to change it to the National Resource Conservation District versus Conservation District for clarity, which I think that one should probably be good, but I would maybe welcome some thoughts on.
Iris, yeah, let me just check on that one to see if we just broaden that to kind of educate, institutions of higher learning versus UVM extension specifically on action A.
Oh, Ryan, go ahead. You can probably answer.
No, happy to let you go, Abby. I think, as we look at the extension network that is national in scope, that the University of Vermont Extension Service is the entity delegated in the state to perform that work. I think there's a lot of partnerships that happen through UVM extension, but as far as a placeholder, I think that's an appropriate framing for the type of technical assistance that is currently delivered to farmers and the specific focus on climate smart agricultural practices would fit best under that framing.
Judy, do you have thoughts on that? Sorry, Abby, you can go, but I would love to hear if maybe flesh out why there's concern there.
Yeah, what I see Marley's comment, Hatch Act actually supports this. Supports what, UVM?
I believe that's correct.
Okay,
Hatch Act supports the state's land grant university to do extension related work.
of course it would, right? This is a land grant university. They stole our land. This is the philosophy I'm talking about.
So
So are you saying places like Middlebury College do not do this type of work?
If the question's directed at me, Marley, then Middlebury College does extensive types of agricultural research and other types of work. But as far as direct technical assistance programming to support farmer learning, that is the role of UVM Extension as the state's land grant university. It doesn't mean nobody else can do it, obviously. There are plenty of others, non-GOs and NGOs and others who do it. But I'm just pointing out that that is UVM's specific role as a land grant university. As staff, I'm certainly not making a recommendation. I'm just providing this information to you.
Thank you. I realize you can't fight the US government easily.
So the question is, I guess, to leave UVM Extension in or try to do something more general. And like what I'm hearing from some folks is that this is particular to UVM Extension because of the system we have with all of its flaws as noted, or whether we need to say something broader.
I think as far as a specific time-bound recommendation for 2025 to achieve the goals of the Global Warming Solutions Act, this is the framework that the state has and could most easily, with the least duplication, deliver services to farmers to work to adopt many of the practices that we've been discussing, across Vermont can be implemented on farms. I think it's an appropriate recommendation from my vantage point.
Judy, further thoughts on that, given the conversation?
Well, Patrick, it's almost impossible to fight a US government standard that has been in place since they stole the land to build the college. That's almost impossible to argue now. But it's one of those philosophy changes and educational issues that should be addressed.
And is that something we do you think, in this recommendation, or is there a separate one about, thinking more broadly about how essentially sort of extension services are provided in the state over time? I'm not sure what the right words are. Do you want to, again, change this recommendation specifically or add another one to the point you just made?
Well, I think there should not be a creation of 2 full-time UVM extension staff and part-time staff. That doesn't mean there shouldn't be more staff. What I'm saying is that it shouldn't all come from UVM because you have one distinct opinion that comes from UVM. There's no diversity there. There's no equity there.
I think I have to disagree with you on that, Judy. I think when you look at the scale, intention, and care that comes with how University of Vermont Extension Service develops and implements programs, there very much of it is, considering, I think, a lot of the questions you just brought up. And I think that the Extension Service has been very effective in building farmer comfort with the management changes that represented a significant deviation from land use management that's very extractive and damaging. And so I think I just have to, working in the spectrum of agricultural, technical, and financial assistance delivery, I just respectfully have to disagree with your framing. It doesn't mean that these are the only folks doing or delivering this work. There's a whole network of providers, extension, state, federal, nonprofit that come together that are funded from many different sources. But I think to the point of these extension groups are very much grant funded, and it is challenging to deliver services at a consistent scale that I think the state needs to further leverage and extend climate benefits from farmers' changes in management. And so I see this line item as a, hey, this would be the returning to, Soil Conservation Service time of the extension person that would help, farmers navigate nutrient management questions and whatever else, and through the lens of climate smart agriculture and how UVM is organized and delivers those services. It's not just crop, it's grazing, it's agroforestry. There's a whole host of services that are delivered through extension that I think are beneficial.
All right, so way forward on this, I'm not clear. We can leave it, we can change it, we can add another recommendation that has additional points that Judy made.
I think if Judy is amenable to it, I might, I don't know. I have a conflict of interest here because, in terms of farm access equity, our extension office in this region of the state is essentially non-existent at this point because of the changes that have been made. And we, farmers in this area really struggle to access the resources that are available in other areas of the state down here. So there's a component of that I think some of this was trying to get at in terms of enabling farmers in different geographical regions to potentially have more support in this regard. So I wonder if there's a bit of both, Zach offers this, is there an Indigenous-led organization or person that could, and I've been thinking about this a lot, certainly in regards to TEK, it would be problematic to hire, let's just be frank, like white people to teach TEK to farmers. That's not the direction in which we want to go. We want to support the integration of Indigenous communities and knowledge in culturally humble and appropriate ways and support the communities, I hope, working together as the future moves forward. So maybe there's some way that we can encompass some of that within this language as a balancing strategy. I'm not really sure that I think that's the tricky thing with all of these things is there's just so many layers to all of this stuff in terms of where we sit in the current systems and how to structure them moving forward to achieve equitable outcomes on a number of different layers of equity.
Judy, what if we added, to kind of build on Zach's, added a bullet, I don't know, the A1 or something. It says grow the capacity of additional Vermont academic institutions and Indigenous-led organizations to offer technical support to farmers and foresters.
Well, that is only part of what I was thinking. At Middlebury College, there's an excellent program on called New Perennials, and they address traditional ecological knowledge in their program. And that's why it was like, we know what's coming out of UVM. It's the same story over and over and over and over again. I mean, I could say more, but I won't. And it just seems that having a little diversity there would give another opinion.
Again, Iris, maybe let's identify any other ones you had today. I think this one's going to need some work. We'll have to figure out how to forward it in just a second. But were there other points?
Yes. Yeah. Okay. I mean, to that, there are just a bunch of these little changes. So adding in, I think this is just changing it to farmers and foresters versus farmers and foragers, sorry, just to recognize the role that foragers play in local food systems. So I'm just going to go through these and then we can, at least for this first strategy, and then we can talk about them, just because that's easier. This is, I think that this was just a grammatical change right here. And then down here we have the change from grade schools to K through 12 schools, and the change from colleges to institutions of higher learning, just to be more inclusive, so that can be things other than colleges. And we just added best management practices instead of BMP, just so that it could be clearer and more readable by the general public, and changed climate change science to the issue of climate change. Yeah, maybe we can just stop there and check, and then we can go to the next strategy, and then, yeah, thoughts on those.
Any other questions on those?
Looks good.
Okay, good. All right.
And then, so this one we've got, this is again just a grammatical change. And then this one is getting rid of the word degraded lands and changing it to unhealthy soil. Making the language here stronger so that it is more directive versus, I think the language previously was, oops, sorry. I'm not sure what the language was, but it wasn't as strong. And then this is adding in community and backyard yard composting and recycling to make sure that it's not these sort of larger out-of-state industrial systems. And to this one was changing sort of the motives behind this, because this had something about getting limiting the spread of invasive species, which, as we've heard, is not in line with TEK. So it's to increase biodiversity and ecosystem health and ultimately reduce emissions. So these are these edits. Thoughts on them?
Any reactions to those? We'll give people just to introduce them. Jake?
Yeah, thanks, Iris. All this is great. I'm just backtracking just a little bit to the prior conversation that was going on and related to what I added to the chat. I mean, to Judy's point, and also respecting what Ryan said, I think with these are the types of recommendations where it's important to, I think, acknowledge or include increasing the capacity around, resourcing Indigenous and BIPOC-led organizations, or sort of increasing competencies of extension programs, and on these issues. And so I think it is important that, like, here's an opportunity where an equity consideration, can be included. We can be explicit about it. And I think the way it's written is sort of, as to Judy's point, kind of favoring, the existing kind of power dynamics and structures that exist. And we can both change that and also hopefully empower, other means of delivering those services. And so, I just included language that sort of had been offered as sort of recommendations and opportunities in our racial equity brief that was developed for Farm to Plate, and that we may be able to sort of mesh with the recommendation around climate education to farms and educational institutions. So I just wanted to kind of raise that more explicitly out and bring it out of the chat.
So Jake, there's some specific language in Farm to Plate we may want to look at as a template. Is that correct?
Yeah, and so I just, the two things that sort of where I point to that is in the racial equity brief, it talks about some opportunities, one of which is resourcing farm service provider positions within Indigenous and BIPOC run organizations, and then also sort of in the Farm to Plate context, it was talked about for farm viability programs, but I think we could expand that more generally to just say, TA, farm-based TA and education programs can diversify their workforce, deepen these competencies and relationships, and to better align with and leverage the goals and strengths of BIPOC farmers and BIPOC-led groups. So that's kind of the a little more context behind what I posted there. that might be able to be integrated into that education recommendation.
Great. Iris, anything else to kind of raise for folks, and then we'll talk about next steps.
No, unless anyone has something else specific they want to bring up, that seems good.
Right. Really great job, and thank you for doing so. So I think we had some back and forth about the language that Judy raised. We have some ideas. Jake suggesting we reference maybe some of the language from farm to plate. The other changes look positive. So I think, Iris, you as the holder of the document, if you're going to kind of take into account, and then, you and Judy can work to make any final revisions to it. All right, good. All right, Billy and Abby, I know I have to jump right at noon, so I'm gonna hand this over to you for public comment, and then next steps to get us to kind of next Friday and how we want to handle that meeting. So I hand it back to the co-chairs now.
Great. Pat, before we lose you, could you just kind of recap what you think our next steps are as our excellent facilitator? I think there's some independent work being done in kind of groups as identified. They're going to bring some suggested changes back to us for next week. One of the pieces I think we're going to try to get done on the language that Judy developed, to get that done before language goes to the council on Tuesday, so that it's done in time to be included in that submission. The rest of the stuff we're going to try to come back to you by Friday. But what other tasks should members be focused on between now and next week?
So I'll do kind of action items from today that are specific and try to get those out tonight. And co-chairs, I'll send them to you first to make sure I got them right.
Okay.
We also didn't talk about the mitigation section of ag, which was kind of submitted separately, though it's very related to pathway A, which I know people may have had some comments on as well, that I think they sent to Ryan at one point. So our thought is that all these documents are now kind of available to you online. One thought we could do is we could send a survey to you all probably Monday that essentially allows you to identify any issue that's really, hopefully you can live with a lot of it because we're late in the game, but things you can't would be to kind of identify in a survey by kind of maybe pathway and strategy and action number, outstanding issues you really you want to talk about with the group next week. So we could do a survey that we'd send out probably first thing Monday morning that would just, it would reference these documents. And for each of our major themes, you would just say, these are the areas I think we need to talk about. And then it would allow you, we'd ask you to fill it out within a few days. It gives us a sense of how to build the agenda for that Friday next. So that was our one thought. If there are better ways to do it, let us know. Yeah, and that's in addition to what we already talked about today, which we still have work on.
Okay, thanks, Pat. And yeah, if folks have questions on that, feel free to raise them right now. Otherwise, Pat will get us some written suggested next steps, and we'll get them out to the group later today or Monday. All right. Thanks, Pat, for your help today and as always. So barring any other comment from members or questions, I guess we'll move on to public comment. Running late, but we'll do it. Let's see. Jenna. So anyone interested in commenting, please raise your Zoom hand or otherwise identify yourselves. And I see Jennifer's hand so far, Cheryl's, Zach's. Okay. Let's go in that order. Thanks, Iris. Good luck with your test. Jennifer, go ahead.
Thanks so much, everybody, and thanks for all the incredibly hard work that you've done. I have a number of comments throughout. I'll try to make them as brief as I can. The first one, thinking about climate education and thinking about the conversation that was brought up. I certainly support the idea of somehow including the phrase of other educational institutions, realizing that UVM is the one that has done that kind of work. But I certainly support including other educational institutions, higher education, as Middlebury was an example there. And then thinking about the coming along in learning and the education piece, that came about, the discussion with Judy's language about eugenics and forest products, and Charlie talking about the broader context was important. It really reminds me of something that I've thought all along, of how this issue of equity and diversity needs to be brought out in this broader context at the beginning and throughout the climate action plan. But how, when individuals, and they certainly will go to particular areas that they're interested in, when there's nothing about that in there, I think that that's problematic as well. So I really support, and I know it's going to be hard to do, and it involves all the subcommittees, but including both language that is broad at the beginning and, when it's appropriate, language that is specific in each pathway. And a quick question on pathway C. I think the heading for number 12 says something about addressing biomass for heat. I'm not sure of that. I may have misread that and I haven't looked back at it. But then you move into the specific points that have to do with biomass and electricity. So I would just encourage looking at that title for pathway C number 12 and making that so it's a good umbrella for the points that come afterwards. I thought the wetland discussion was incredible. And it makes me think, I really like Jake's comment about the language that California uses. And honestly, I'm not interagency climate action team. Something like that would be amazing, because I think we risk losing the climate focus of everything that you're doing if we don't have something like that. That said, I think it should be broader than current agency members. And I'm also sensitive, knowing mostly from Agency of Natural Resources and mostly with rare plant species, how agency folks are given additional tasks to do, and it takes them away from the things they're meant to do. And so it's a very tricky issue. And I think that without including others, then you risk the diversity and equity piece of it as well. And then I think my final comment has to do with something you didn't talk about, and that's pathway F and amending UVA. And it strikes me that there are a number of pieces of it that still remain, for me, non-specific. And I'll just give some examples. I'm looking at D, amend the use value appraisal to allow for one, greater development of old forest structure, to increase carbon storage targets as articulated is the targets for Vermont conservation design. And that, I think, just some specificity that could say a forest management plan can now include that. And, again, I don't know exactly how to phrase that. And then the enrollment of wildland reserves. I honestly have forgotten to look at what the definition for forest parks and recreation, but I wonder if some sort of hyperlink there would be useful. And then privately held parcels with forever wild easements could be enrolled in the current use program and conservation category. It's my understanding that that's already the case. For example, Green Mountain Conservancy is a 501c3. They have almost 1,000 acres, and basically they have an easement. So that's not something new, unless I'm misunderstanding it. And I think number 4 is the most important one here. And again, I think funding is critical to make this happen. The Vermont Land Trust is stretched thin. Foresters, I'm sure, are stretched thin. In any case, all right, that was not as brief as I had hoped.
May I jump in with just a quick answer to Jennifer's last question there, because I think I'm probably one of the only people here who knows, or maybe somebody else does, but just to make sure. The situation is that a 501c3 can own land that has a forever wild easement on it today in Vermont. A 501c3 can, but a private citizen cannot. So if you put an easement on your land, you are a landowner and you put an easement on your land, you cannot benefit from the use value appraisal program, a forever wild easement on your land. So that is the difference here. That's what this is getting at, is that if a 501c3 puts an easement on your land, you as a landowner will be able to participate in the use value appraisal program for the first time if this recommendation was acted on by the state. So that's just that's the difference there. A land trust can already do this and a landowner cannot.
Thanks, Jennifer and Zach. Let's go to Cheryl, then we'll go back to Zach.
Hi, everybody. I have a few comments on a variety of things. One is that, again, a lot of people know, we all know this here, but I just really want to point it out again, is that trees and forests are a lot more than carbon storage and sequestration. And that's something really important to think about in all aspects of everything we write. And that's the equity portion, I think, also. From early on in the conversation, regardless of whether a clear cut is officially a forest, in actuality, it's not. And, you know, an actual forest does have blowdowns, but they're really very different from clear cuts or even some of the prescriptions that are just leaving a few trees standing here and there. So it's also a couple of acres, usually at most in this area anyhow. I mean, it's more than that sometimes, of course. But the very most important thing, I think, that people are not really looking at is that now research has shown that large trees, old trees continue and sequester and store carbon much more and much better and much quicker than smaller trees until I'm not sure what age. I put something in the chat, but very old trees continue to sequester and store a lot more carbon than younger trees. So that argument just doesn't stand at all anymore. You can find it in a lot of places. With regard to wetlands, so the United States has lost more than 50% of its wetlands. I think it's a lot more, but then Vermont has lost anywhere between 35 and 50% from various studies. What really does net gain mean? Like, does it mean restoring previously filled, tiled, drained wetlands? Does it mean increasing delineation efforts? And or does it mean creation and mitigation from when other wetlands are destroyed, and then creating new wetlands in an inappropriate spot, but just you know, very convenient for humans? So and even Pennsylvania has a net gain wetland policy, and Pennsylvania is not great. They apparently, since I'm not sure since when, have restored more than 4,000, restored wetlands more than 4,000. So we have to move forward to say that, yes, we have to do this equitably. So we have to look at agriculture and we have to look at forestry, but we have to do the right thing. And we have to also do other things, even though it's going to put somebody out of what they are doing now. And we have to figure out how to do it better. We don't necessarily have all the answers right now, but the answer isn't to not restore the wetlands. They're carbon sinks. And I'm sorry to not be able to tell you how much carbon they sequester or store. So that's another thing that I wanted to bring up. Let's see. Also, in the biomass portion, and I don't know the letter pathway, but you call out to take people out of the biomass energy creation industry and call out that to retrain them in forestry. So why, and renewable resources. So why call out forestry or anything at all to retrain them in? How about somebody can be retrained in whatever they want to do, not call out forestry here, because they can go and move into any other field. And just biomass, tree biomass, and I don't know about the other plant biomass because I haven't really studied that, but biomass, energy, and heat is not the answer, even though we want to keep doing logging, even though some people want to keep on doing logging. It's still not the answer. And that has been also, that's new research is showing that biomass is not the answer. You can always find people doing studies saying that biomass is the answer. Tree biomass, I'm saying, because you can always find people saying one thing or other. And also, research in universities is funded by, it's not uninterested parties that are funding the research. Okay. Another thing is with regard to compact settlement strategies, thanks, Billy, I agree completely. We should not just pull it out, but refer to it. It's really important. It's probably one of the most important things, and it absolutely belongs in this subcommittee recommendation because ecosystems and agriculture have everything to do with compact settlements. Constantly, there are, there's forest land and there is agricultural land continuously, regularly being having parcels sold off, parcelization, rural sprawl, etc. I see it all around here down in southern Vermont. It's everywhere. And when you were talking about equity, I guess maybe something needs to be figured out here with regard to the equity of just the landowners that aren't even farmers, but just hold land, and they don't have a lot of money, and they're just cutting their several hundred acres up bit by bit to
Thanks. Yeah, we're really aware of these land use trends, so I don't mean to cut you off, but I just really precise feedback on our recommendations would be really helpful right now, Cheryl. Thanks.
Okay, thanks. Yep.
Okay. Anything else? Okay, thanks. Zach?
Thanks, Billy. I really appreciate this subcommittee's willingness to stick it out. And, Cheryl Joy and Jennifer and others have been giving a lot of time to this effort and are extremely patient to wait until the end of these meetings to comment. And I'm sure they have things that started at 12 that they're also late for. So I really appreciate everybody's attention and patience. I know that it's taxing. I just wanted to thank Judy again for bringing up, I think, some really great points throughout the meeting today. And at the end, it seems like we got to maybe a really great action item. I really like that what she has been sharing is turning into action. Something that I just wanted to, take a step back and I feel like so often we, in the very brief period of time that we have to comment here, try to squeeze in those specific points related to, of course, what's in the climate action plan. But I think I just want to offer this reminder that Vermont conservation design says, Bob Zano and Eric Sorensen, two of our most wise, ecologists here in Vermont, that just 0.1% of Vermont's forests resemble anything like what was here prior to European settlement, less than 0.1%. Just let that sink in for a second. And I think that's probably even a high estimate. And of course, that doesn't even account for the species that are missing from this landscape that disappeared in the blink of an eye. So this is the Ag and Ecosystems Committee. So as we think about the policies that we're putting forward here, as you kind of make final tweaks to this package that you've been working on for so long, I hope that you'll keep that in mind. That when we talk about the rebound of Vermont's forests, are we talking about forests or are we talking about trees that have grown back over the last 100 years? And what more will it take to actually create the forests that are our native ecosystem here in Vermont? And I think that's the question that is kind of before you all. I hope that's kind of the vision that you're all working towards, is creating those actual ecosystems, not just trees, but ecosystems that we all depend on for our own and for all the other life, here in Vermont. So I guess just wanted to kind of leave you with that, as Sue Moore said, to kind of, aim higher. Just a couple more specifics here. There's still time to make another edit to the UVA item here related to a wildlands or kind of open space category, again, which every other New England state has. If you move forward with this recommendation that's in the plan right now, what it is saying is that some arbitrary definition that State Forest Parks and Recreation comes up with is the starting point for a landowner to be able to enroll their land into a open space category. What would be so much simpler and akin to what every other New England state does is to say, if you qualify for UVA, as any other landowner does today to manage their forests for timber, they should also be eligible to manage their forest passively. There should not be some extra threshold put on a landowner if they want to manage their lands passively, if they want to put it into a no management, or I hate to call it no management, it's management, it's just a different kind of management category. So let's not kind of put judgment there or bias there in a way that, again, is different from any other New England state, in the way that we operate our use value appraisal program. We still got time to make that change, and I hope that you will consider making that change, because it's really, really biased the way it's written right now. Next, we barely had time to talk about the carbon budget in this group. And as has been said before, it really concerns me. This budget is focused on kind of this misguided notion of sequestration being kind of the end all and be all right now. And as Cheryl Joy said a second ago, and Jennifer has said before, old forests not only store, but sequester tremendous amounts of carbon. And it makes no sense to put the kind of focus on creating more young forests, taking down what are rapidly maturing forests in Vermont and shifting them into a much younger category is not a way to get through the climate crisis. So there's so much more that could be said here. I know your brains are full from a really robust conversation today. Logging has a place in Vermont. It always will, and it should. But it's different from, climate solutions. These are two very different things. We need a wood products industry. We also need real aggressive climate solutions. And the very best thing we can do for our climate is to manage more of Vermont's forests to let them grow old. Best thing we can do for water, for drought, for flooding, for our native species. That's what we should be focused on, is restoring those ecosystems. And so again, we've got some good components already in here to that effect, especially related to VCD and the old forest targets there. But I know that there's even more that we could do here in the next month to make this climate action plan all that it can be. I would welcome the chance to work with you all on any tweaks or questions that that you might have. So please feel free to reach out. Thank you, and appreciate this chance to comment.
Thanks, Zach, and thanks everyone. Cheryl, I see your hand still up. Do you have any follow-up comments you want to share with us? Happy to hear them.
No, I'm sorry that I left it up, but I just do want to tell, since I'm here, I would like to say that I agree with 100% with what Zach just said just last.
Great, thank you. Abby, would you like to comment?
I just finished. I figured I would finish this out today by saying, one, we all do really appreciate the time and effort and energy that those of you from the public who have continued to attend the meetings week after week have put into all of this. And I'm a bit concerned with what I sense to be the notion that this, I just am going to continue to repeat what I think I've said before, which is we can do the best that we can do in this subcommittee, and we'll continue to pursue that to the best of our ability. But the reality is that we don't control where these recommendations go from here. We don't control what the final climate action plan looks like. That is in the control of the Climate Council, and then within the legislature and the executive branch. And so I do want to encourage you too, that, you know, what you're offering, the perspective and the education, et cetera, don't lose your energy all here. Because I think if these are things that you really believe in and want to see happen, you're going to need to, along with the rest of us, take that energy forward as this actually makes its way into the legislature, where these things become real. Because at this moment, I'm really concerned about that. I keep hearing things in different places that make me feel like there is a sense that this climate action plan is a bit of a magical thinking pathway as to the way forward, or that, you know, I've even heard it described as this is solving climate change. And I think that that's an insane thought. I'm not implying that any of you think that. I want us to be grounded in reality as to what the work of this subcommittee can actually accomplish and where it can accomplish that, and then what it's going to take to try to see these visions become fully realized within our state. So thank you, everyone. With that, unless there's anything else from the public, I think we'll close it for today. And I really appreciate everybody hanging on and listening in to the additional perspective that was offered. Otherwise, I think it's a Friday. Happy weekend.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Abby.